Hey guys, tonight we drift back to a moment when the world stopped pretending it was warm. The bombs of the Second World War have only just cooled. The air still smells faintly of cordite and cigarette smoke, and yet somehow everyone senses that the peace they're breathing is laced with frost. You probably won't survive this era without at least one existential crisis per decade. But don't worry, we'll take it slow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video, and what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand in 1945 Berlin, a city that looks like someone dropped a god-sized ashtray onto Europe and walked away. Concrete crumbles under your boots. The smoke of 1,000 chimneys clings to your coat. Children play with spent bullet casings as if they're marbles. Everywhere, men with papers in their hands and fear in their eyes wonder which side of the map they'll wake up on tomorrow. The Americans and Soviets have met in the middle of Germany like two polite neighbors who just realized their lawns overlap by a few centimeters. Each smiles, neither blinks. You can almost hear the clink of ice forming between their handshakes. The mainstream fact is obvious. By 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two dominant superpowers, each owning half the victory and all the suspicion. But the quirky bit, the kind that makes historians smirk into their coffee, is that American GIs traded cigarettes and nylons with Soviet soldiers at the Elbe River for souvenirs and vodka, turning the first encounter of the Cold War into an impromptu swap meet. And the open debate that still crackles today is whether the Cold War was truly inevitable or just a tragic miscommunication between two paranoid ideals that spoke different dialects of fear. You take a breath and listen to the silence after the greatest noise humans ever made. It's a silence that feels too quiet to trust. Factories that once forged tanks now stamp out washing machines. Yet the rhythm of production still beats like drums for a war that hasn't technically ended. In Washington, men in gray suits tap their pens against glasses of bourbon and say words like containment. In Moscow, comrades in equally gray suits sip black tea and say words like inevitability. Two languages, same palette. Even the color gray becomes a national anthem. You move through the crowded corridors of the new United Nations, a place that smells like fresh paint and forced optimism. Delegates smile for photographs and then race back to their hotel rooms to write reports about how little they trust one another. It's almost adorable if existential tension can be adorable. You imagine someone trying to explain to a 1945 citizen that within 4 years the world would split into two spheres and a thing called NATO would exist. They'd laugh and ask if that's a new toothpaste. The first Cold War winter isn't meteorological, it's psychological. An entire planet learns a new form of weather. Permanent chill with occasional hot gusts of panic. Every radio broadcast becomes a forecast of ideological fronts moving east or west. You picture a weatherman pointing at Europe and saying, "High pressure of mutual suspicion today, possible nuclear showers later this century." Meanwhile, citizens everywhere try to go on with life. They buy new cars with chrome smiles, watch cartoons where cats blow each other up with dynamite, and pretend it's not metaphor. Your ASMR brain notices the soft click of typewriters in newsrooms, the whisper of files sliding into metal cabinets marked top secret. If you lean in, you can hear the Cold War being born not with a bang but with a shuffling of paper. The Marshall Plan arrives, a care package the size of a continent. Europe receives it like a friend showing up with soup after a disaster, grateful but suspicious of the recipe. Some see generosity, others see an American fridge magnet stuck to every repaired factory. In Moscow, Stalin decides if charity exists it must be a trap, so he builds his own economic fence called Kumkan, a name that sounds like a brand of cheap soap but means keep out. You imagine a Soviet bureaucrat writing that in block letters and nodding proudly. The world's map slowly hardens like cement. Each new treaty is a trowel stroke. By 1947, the Truman Doctrine has promised to support anyone fighting communism, and suddenly communism is everywhere, even under beds, according to some American radio hosts who probably need a nap. A man in Athens and a peasant in Ankara become new pawns in a global board game that neither asked to join. You catch yourself smiling at the absurdity of it, how humans manage to turn even ideology into a competitive sport. Somewhere, a young George Orwell scribbles the word Cold War in an essay, not realizing he's naming a whole century of anxiety. You wander through London fog, hear Big Ben ring over ration queues, and think how strange it is that after defeating fascism, the world still can't agree on what freedom means. The American definition comes with Coca-Cola and credit cards. The Soviet one comes with bread lines and heroic posters of tractor drivers. Somewhere in between lies reality, waiting to be misinterpreted. The quirky image that sticks with you is that of Soviet scientists experimenting with weather control to prove socialism's superiority, a literal attempt to out-engineer God's forecast. It mostly resulted in muddy boots and some very confused farmers. Meanwhile, the U.S. decides its greatest weapon is Hollywood, and sends movie reels abroad like missiles of melodrama. By the late 40s, even cartoons are strategic assets. You can't help but chuckle somewhere a mouse with red shorts is fighting communism. Back in the United States, the word atomic starts appearing on everything from burgers to hair salons. Atomic energy, atomic age, atomic couches. It's like branding your future with a mushroom cloud and calling it fashion. You picture a 1950s salesman saying, "This recliner can withstand fallout," as his teeth glint like chrome. Behind the jokes lurks a truth no one wants to say aloud, that the bomb was not an ending but an invitation to the next act. Some historians argue that America's monopoly on nuclear weapons made conflict inevitable, like one kid in a playground owning all the marbles. Others say the Soviets would have found another reason anyway. You sigh because humans rarely need good reasons for bad ideas. Snow begins to fall outside a Paris cafe window. You watch flakes melt in your coffee and think how Cold Wars always start with people too hot with pride to notice the temperature dropping. Somewhere a radio plays soft jazz, another American export, and you wonder if melody might be a better weapon than missiles. For a moment, the world feels possible again. Then someone mentions Poland, and the temperature drops 10 degrees. At night, you hear the rumble of trains carrying coal, steel, and hope to rebuild Europe, and you realize hope is a commodity too. Factories reopen under neon signs that say progress, but behind them stand men with clipboards from either side counting how many bolts could be turned into bullets if necessary. That's the strangest part. The world does rebuild. It just does so with an escape plan. By 1948, Berlin is cut into zones like a cake at a birthday party. No one enjoys. The Allies airlift supplies over Soviet blockades, and children run into streets to catch tiny parachutes of chocolate falling from planes. That's your quirky human detail. Operation Little Victuals, a real campaign where American pilots dropped candy for kids, proving that even in a proxy siege, someone still cares about dessert. You can almost taste the sugar melting in the cold air. But the larger lesson sticks to your teeth. Every gesture of kindness becomes propaganda material by morning. By the time you walk back through the snow, you understand why they called it cold. It's not about temperature at all. It's about how warm the world pretended to be. And as the night settles around you, somewhere between hope and humor, you sense that this frozen peace will last a long time, shimmering under the moonlight like ice that refuses to melt. You wake to a world that's technically at peace but feels like it's just holding its breath under a weighted blanket. The smoke has lifted from Europe, yet the air somehow vibrates with competition, like two old boxers pretending to shake hands while measuring the other's reach. You stand in 1946, the planet freshly divided between two victorious titans who can't seem to share the same sandbox without drawing invisible lines. America stretches like a golden retriever basking in its new wealth, factories humming, soldiers home with GI Bills and dreams of two-car garages. While the Soviet Union limps back from apocalypse, its cities reduced to rubble but its pride untouched. Somewhere in the distance, the ghost of the war still coughs. The mainstream historical fact here is clear. By the mid-1940s, the United States produced nearly half the world's industrial output, while the Soviet Union controlled the largest land army ever assembled in peacetime. Each side holds a different superpower. One makes refrigerators that hum, the other makes tanks that never stop. You wandering through this strange new era can almost hear capitalism and communism trying to flirt but tripping over their own ideologies. The quirky tidbit is that during the first post-war peace conferences, translators had to invent words on the spot for terms like consumerism and bourgeois luxury, because in Russian, the closest phrase literally meant soft living nonsense. Imagine explaining the concept of Tupperware to a Politburo member who still thinks food storage is ideological. The open debate that scholars keep swirling in their teacups is whether this clash was ever about ideology at all, or simply about geography and trauma. Did the Cold War start because America feared communism, or because both sides just wanted to be the world's main character in history's next episode? You breathe in that uncertainty like static on an untuned radio. Across the ocean, President Truman stares at a glowing globe in the Oval Office, his expression somewhere between pride and heartburn. He has the bomb. Yes, the godlike weapon that ended the war. But he also knows he can't use it again without ending civilization's trial period. In Moscow, Stalin adjusts his pipe, his mustache glistening like winter frost, and decides that since he can't match America's bomb yet, he'll match its fear. You feel the tension forming like condensation on glass, invisible, then suddenly everywhere. Newspapers call it peace, but you can tell it's only the intermission between two acts of the same play. The U.S. is throwing money across oceans through the Marshall Plan, feeding Europe with canned optimism and Coca-Cola, while the USSR spreads ideology like fertilizer across eastern soil. Both think they're saving the world. Both suspect the world prefers not to be saved. In the background, you can almost hear the soundtrack of the era. Jazz saxophones on one side, balalakas on the other, each riffing about freedom in completely different keys. Everyday people adapt in curious ways. American suburbanites plant flags next to white picket fences, while Soviet citizens hang portraits of Lenin beside their samovars. You picture a global neighborhood watch program, where everyone's window blinds twitch. The Cold War doesn't have front lines yet, just front lawns. Somewhere in Kansas, a housewife buys a pressure cooker because modern living demands it, while in Kyiv, a mother reuses every glass jar because scarcity has become a patriotic duty. Different systems, same nervous energy. Keep busy, don't think too much, and maybe the anxiety will pass. The sky, however, disagrees. Test detonations in deserts send mushroom clouds blooming like hellish roses. Propaganda balloons drift over borders carrying leaflets that read "Our way is better." Even the weather seems partisan. You joke softly that if it ever rains sideways, people will accuse it of ideological bias. Beneath that humor lies a universal exhaustion. Everyone's still cleaning up from the last nightmare, but already writing scripts for the next. One evening, you stroll through a cafe in Paris, where intellectuals debate whether humanity's true enemy is hunger or bureaucracy. Sartre fumes. Camus smirks, and an American journalist scribbles in his notebook something about the battle for men's minds. The waitress brings weak coffee, sugar still rationed, and whispers that she prefers jazz to politics. You tip her in francs and second-hand optimism. The world feels small again, smaller than its ambitions. You think of how a few decisions made in smoky rooms are about to shape the daily rhythm of billions, what they'll learn in school, what they'll watch on television, which gods they'll be allowed to believe in. For the first time in history, ideology travels faster than ships. Radio waves and film reels replace armies. If the Second World War was about bullets, this one will be about ideas wearing tuxedos. The phrase psychological warfare starts to trend, though nobody admits who invented it. In Washington, bureaucrats draw up new acronyms like over-caffeinated poets, CIA, NSC, NATO. Each promises order. Each sounds faintly like a new breakfast cereal. Start your day with a balanced serving of collective defense. You imagine the ad saying, "Meanwhile, the Soviets counter with Cominform, a network of loyal parties ready to denounce anyone who blinks incorrectly." Somewhere, a Hungarian student wonders if joining a youth club is worth the paperwork. You realize that the planet has split not just politically but emotionally. Western optimism hums like neon. Eastern stoicism sits heavy like lead. Both think the other is delusional. And yet here's the strange part. Both sides secretly admire what the other has. Soviet citizens dream of American blue jeans, and American students envy the grandeur of Russian literature. Humanity's mutual crush continues, awkward and unspoken. The mainstream fact that anchors this era. Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in March 1946 at Westminster College. His gravelly voice describes an iron curtain descending across the continent, and millions feel the temperature drop a few degrees just hearing it. You sit in the crowd of memory, hearing the applause that follows, but noticing how half the world winces. The quirky sidelight is that after the speech, Stalin reportedly called Churchill a warmonger, yet privately ordered transcripts of it distributed to Soviet officers as required reading, as if studying the enemy's poetry. The debate that lingers like pipe smoke is whether Churchill foresaw inevitable division or merely accelerated it by naming it out loud. Sometimes words freeze faster than actions. You wander eastward, past Prague and Warsaw, where new governments bloom overnight like concrete flowers. Soviet advisors arrive with briefcases and a shared vocabulary of collectivization, industrialization, and we'll fix it later. In villages still missing roofs, people paint murals of tractors. The revolution that once promised equality now demands efficiency. In a Moscow cinema, audiences cheer a film about heroic factory workers who produce twice the quota by sheer enthusiasm. Halfway across the world, American audiences cheer Gene Kelly dancing in the rain because capitalism sells joy as a product line. You can't help but smirk. Two economies, same choreography, different soundtrack. The irony writes itself. Traveling through time feels like riding a slow escalator between optimism and dread. Each country tries to out-hope the other. American schools introduce freedom curriculums, and Soviet textbooks insist capitalism breeds loneliness. Somewhere, a small boy in Iowa and a small girl in Minsk memorize identical slogans about peace while their governments test new missiles. You want to tell them that the real danger isn't the bomb, it's the homework assignment called history that never ends. By the early 50s, the United States unveils the hydrogen bomb, 10 times the firepower of Hiroshima. The world blinks and pretends to adjust. Scientists who once dreamed of splitting atoms for energy now debate whether morality can survive mathematics. A quirky anecdote. Edward Teller, father of the H-bomb, once played the piano to calm his nerves before test calculations, proving that even apocalyptic inventors need a soundtrack. And scholars still debate whether deterrence truly kept the peace or just postponed the apocalypse by mutual exhaustion. Through all this, you notice the propaganda machine becoming self-aware. American TV commercials promote freedom through laundry detergent. Soviet posters show farmers smiling so hard their cheeks must ache. You imagine them meeting in some cosmic advertising conference, swapping notes on fonts. Underneath, the global subconscious trembles with what psychologists later call atomic anxiety. Nightmares about falling skies become fashionable. Therapists coin phrases like existential dread while selling more couches than ever. You chuckle softly. Trust capitalism to monetize the apocalypse. Back at the geopolitical scale, Truman outlines the containment policy, a phrase that sounds hygienic until you realize it's about boxing in an ideology across half the globe. The Soviets respond by fortifying Eastern Europe and declaring the West morally bankrupt. Both are technically correct from their own angles, which is the most dangerous kind of correctness. You sense humanity rehearsing for a drama it doesn't understand, with nuclear lighting and no dress rehearsal. Still, life insists on going on. Baseball scores continue. The Moscow metro runs on time. Somewhere Sinatra croons "I've Got the World on a String," and someone in Leningrad hums along, unaware it's forbidden but enjoying the melody anyway. The Cold War becomes less a conflict and more a mood, like humidity you can't see but still feel in your bones. The quirky but telling image of this period might be that of Joseph Stalin commissioning a world map the size of a ballroom, with pins marking every communist sympathizer he believed existed. Historians argue over whether it was paranoia or passion for geography. Either way, it's a reminder that power often starts with pushpins. On the other side, the U.S. builds suburban dreamscapes filled with toasters and optimism, quietly training its citizens to see consumption as patriotism. A child eating cereal becomes a micro-victory over Marx. You can almost hear the crunch echo across oceans. By the late 40s, it's clear the two giants have stopped pretending they like each other. Speeches grow colder, borders tighter. Yet beneath all this frost, humanity discovers something astonishing. Innovation thrives under pressure. Jet engines, radar, antibiotics, even early computers emerge from the same tension that could destroy them. Scholars later call it the paradox of the Cold War, that fear made us efficient. You roll the phrase on your tongue like bitter chocolate. Perhaps progress is just anxiety with good PR. As you step away from this era's static, you sense the world shrinking again. Communications faster, imaginations larger, distrust permanent. The Cold War isn't simply dividing nations, it's rewriting how people think about trust itself. The hum of machinery, the flicker of neon, the steady beat of typewriter keys in both Washington and Moscow merge into one hypnotic rhythm. The planet becomes a single shared insomnia, everyone lying awake under different flags, wondering what the other side is dreaming. And as you drift toward the next section, you remember the image from Berlin, children chasing candy dropped from planes. The sweetness still lingers, proof that even amid rivalry, someone thought to make a child smile. Maybe that's what keeps the world turning when the giants refuse to sleep. You stand somewhere between memory and metaphor, watching an invisible line being drawn across a continent like a magician's final flourish gone wrong. It's 1947, and Europe is quietly splitting in two. Not with explosions, but with paperwork, propaganda, and the unnerving sound of pens scratching over fresh borders. The war's rubble is still warm enough to smell of dust and diesel, yet people are already building new fences, not out of barbed wire this time, but out of fear, loyalty, and economic policy. You breathe in the chill of a world learning how to mistrust politely. In the West, jazz wafts from cafes, promising prosperity and imported oranges. In the East, factories hum to the rhythm of 5-year plans and suspicious glances. The mainstream fact sits at the heart of this transformation. By 1948, nearly every nation east of Germany had fallen under Soviet influence, their elections more choreographed than contested. Parliaments still met, but only to applaud in unison. The quirky side note that rarely makes it into textbooks is that one of the earliest physical manifestations of this divide wasn't a wall at all, but a train car shortage. The Soviets began recalling rail cars from Western Europe after the war, leaving coal and grain stranded on tracks like orphans of industry, a logistical cold shoulder that literally froze economies. The open, scholarly debate, still argued with civilized fury in faculty lounges, is whether Stalin's grip on Eastern Europe was a defensive buffer against another invasion or an imperial appetite disguised as socialism. You decide it's probably both, because history loves to multitask when it comes to paranoia. You wander through a twilight Europe where signs change languages faster than you can blink. In Prague, posters of smiling workers begin to outnumber church steeples. In Budapest, radios hum with new anthems about collective triumphs, all in the same suspicious key of C minor. Meanwhile, the West is staging its own theater of optimism. Glittering shop windows, Marshall Plan billboards, and neon that promises tomorrow is better. Terms apply. You imagine standing at the literal midpoint, one foot in capitalist fluorescence, the other in socialist shadow, and wondering which side has the better snacks. The answer, of course, depends on whether you value chewing gum or free bread. Somewhere behind you, Churchill's Iron Curtain metaphor clangs in the distance like a closing elevator door, sealing off half the world with a tidy metallic sigh. You glance around and realize how quietly it happened. No ceremony, no fireworks, just silence hardening into policy. In this hush, Berlin becomes both symbol and symptom. The city, still gasping from wartime ruin, now finds itself dissected like a frog in a classroom experiment. You walk down Unter den Linden, stepping from American to Soviet jurisdiction like a tourist collecting stamps of ideology. Children draw chalk lines in the street and call them borders. Soldiers watch, half smiling, half worried the chalk might be prophetic. The quirky image that historians adore. In the early days, before any wall, East Berlin residents could cross freely for theater performances. And Western opera houses started offering half-communist discounts to lure Eastern audiences. Imagine Wagner as a diplomatic weapon. The scholars still argue whether cultural exchange delayed the wall's construction or merely gave it better acoustics. You sip the imaginary coffee of a memory and watch how irony keeps the lights on in dark times. Back in Washington, a sense of righteous purpose brews alongside the morning coffee. George Kennan's long telegram, that 8,000-word confession of American anxiety, circulates through the State Department like gossip in a small town. Its message, contain the Soviets, or be contained by them, becomes doctrine faster than you can say classified. Truman reads it, nods, and decides it's time for the Truman Doctrine, promising aid to any nation resisting communism, which in practice means everyone with a flag and a fear. Greece and Turkey become the first test cases, like lab mice in an ideological experiment. Dollars flow, speeches echo, and somewhere in Moscow, Stalin coughs dismissively into his tea. The Cold War is now official, but not yet comfortable. Both sides fumble for metaphors to explain themselves. Free world, people's democracy, mutually assured misunderstanding. You imagine them as rival podcasters who can't stop subtweeting each other through manifestos. The streets of Eastern Europe fill with parades celebrating liberation, though the banners look suspiciously mass-produced. Statues of Stalin multiply faster than rabbits, Every city square seems to sprout a granite mustache overnight. In Poland, the phrase "brotherhood of nations" becomes a code for "please don't ask questions." Western journalists write dispatches describing gray skies and polite censorship. One American correspondent jokes that Soviet weather reports probably list cloudy with a chance of ideology. You chuckle quietly because humor becomes the only safe protest when truth is rationed. At night, citizens listen to the crackling voices of Radio Free Europe under blankets, turning up the volume when static sounds like courage. Across the ocean, Americans tune in to McCarthy hearings, proving paranoia travels both directions with impressive efficiency. The mainstream historical anchor, back in Germany, the air itself feels divided. The 1948 Berlin blockade becomes the first great standoff of the Cold War, a contest between route control and logistical stubbornness. You stand near Tempelhof Airport at dawn, hearing the drone of Allied cargo planes slicing through fog. Children wave from rooftops, counting how many candy parachutes will drift their way today. Each chocolate bar becomes a declaration of liberty wrapped in foil. The mainstream fact: during the 11-month airlift, Western pilots delivered over 2 million tons of supplies. The quirky anecdote: British and American crews started naming their aircraft things like the Spirit of Freedom and Fat Annie, as if optimism itself could fly. And the open debate remains whether Stalin truly intended to starve Berlin into submission or simply misjudged how stubbornly Western democracies would feed it by sky. Either way, when the blockade ends in 1949, no one feels victorious, only hungrier for the next confrontation. As night falls over this partitioned continent, you notice how ideology infiltrates everything from architecture to art. Western Europe rebuilds in glass and steel, transparency as philosophy, while Eastern cities favor brutalist concrete, heavy enough to crush dissent. Painters choose sides without meaning to. Abstraction becomes a Western statement of individuality, realism, an Eastern badge of unity. You stand before two canvases and realize they're arguing about the same sunrise. Somewhere in the middle, Picasso sketches a dove for the World Peace Congress. It becomes the universal symbol of calm, even though both sides secretly wonder whose cage it came from. Life goes on amid the metaphors. A Polish farmer learns to grow potatoes according to collective efficiency metrics. A French teenager buys a transistor radio and accidentally tunes into Moscow, discovering foreign propaganda sounds a lot like jazz played slightly out of tune. In both worlds, people marry, argue, dream, and occasionally joke about the absurdity of living inside a geopolitical freezer. Your inner ASMR narrator notes the rustle of ration cards, the hum of streetcars, the muffled laughter behind closed doors, small rebellions disguised as daily life. The Cold War isn't fought only in parliaments. It's fought in the kitchen, where scarcity competes with imagination. You look up and realize the stars above Europe don't care about politics. They shine evenly over capitalism and communism, unbothered by the slogans beneath. Yet, even astronomy becomes ideological. Western astronomers name comets after individuals. Eastern ones prefer numbers and collectives. It's a small thing, but somehow perfectly symbolic. The quirky fringe story that warms your insomnia. In 1950, Soviet scientists tried to send a message to extraterrestrials using Morse code beamed from a radio telescope. The first hello of humanity, delivered in Marxist-approved rhythm. Scholars still debate whether that experiment was genuine scientific curiosity or cosmic propaganda. Either way, no aliens replied, which in retrospect might be the wisest diplomatic decision anyone made that decade. By now, you understand the Iron Curtain isn't just a barrier between nations. It's a curtain inside people's heads. It divides dinner conversations, bedtime stories, even lullabies. In the East, children fall asleep to tales of heroic workers. In the West, to dreams of astronauts and cowboys. Each generation inherits not just borders, but emotional climates. You picture a boy in Warsaw tracing maps of the West he's never seen, while a girl in Chicago imagines the Soviet Union as a land of endless snow and spies who never blink. They're both wrong, of course, but myths travel faster than visas. And, through it all, the planet keeps pretending it's sane. International summits occur with forced smiles. Ambassadors trade toasts they don't believe in, and both sides declare victory after every stalemate. You start to think the Cold War's greatest invention isn't the bomb or the satellite. It's irony. Everyone participates, no one confesses, and the audience keeps clapping because the show must go on. Somewhere, a playwright named Brecht nods knowingly from exile. You take one last look at the invisible divide. No wall yet, just shadows shaped like policies, and feel the temperature drop another degree. The Iron Curtain has descended not with thunder, but with paperwork, and beneath it humanity adjusts to twilight living. But the night isn't silent. You can still hear laughter, faint and defiant, echoing from both sides. Proof that even under the heaviest curtain, someone's still telling jokes. You wake to a world that hums faintly, as if the entire planet has been plugged into an electrical socket of anxiety and no one can find the switch to turn it off. It's the early 1950s, and every living room on Earth has become an honorary command center. The television flickers, the radio hisses, and somewhere out in Nevada or Kazakhstan, a mushroom cloud curls upward like a ghost learning ballet. The war that ended with light brighter than the sun has convinced everyone that light itself is now suspicious. You step outside and breathe air that tastes faintly metallic, not because of fallout, but because of fear. Governments call it progress, poets call it madness, and you call it insomnia with better funding. The mainstream fact grounding this dreamlike dread is that between 1945 and 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union conducted more than 400 nuclear tests, many in plain view of their own citizens. People watched atomic detonations from hotel rooftops in Las Vegas, wearing sunglasses and drinking cocktails named the Daisy Cutter. That's the human race for you, turning apocalypse into a matinee. The quirky detail, almost too absurd to be true, is that one U.S. department store once advertised atomic makeup kits, promising to protect the skin from radiation while maintaining a lovely glow. The slogan writers were technically correct, just not in the way they intended. And the open scholarly debate, still humming in the background, is whether nuclear deterrence truly prevented World War III, or merely froze it into a permanent rehearsal that kept humanity performing anxiety for half a century. You can't help thinking both answers feel right and wrong in equal measure. You drift through an American suburb where the grass is trimmed with military precision, and the neighbors compete over who has the most aesthetically pleasing fallout shelter. A salesman knocks on a door offering family protection packages, complete with canned beans, board games, and something labeled "Turn to radiation-proof wallpaper." The homeowner nods gravely and asks whether it comes in pastel. Somewhere else, a public service film plays in classrooms, cheerfully instructing children to duck and cover beneath desks that couldn't stop a falling stapler, let alone a thermonuclear blast. You hear the narrator's upbeat baritone promising safety, and it sounds suspiciously like a lullaby for nervous adults. The country's new bedtime story begins with, "Once upon a time, there was mutual, assured destruction." Across the ocean, the Soviet Union answers the same fear with concrete and optimism measured in megatons. In Moscow, proud engineers unveil the first successful test of the RDS-1 bomb, nicknamed First Lightning, proving that lightning strikes twice when ideology demands symmetry. Stalin smiles his wolfish smile, half victory, half hangover, and declares that balance has been restored to the universe. You imagine the Kremlin that night lit by the glow of desk lamps over maps of the world. 2 continents playing chess with radioactive pawns. Somewhere between them, you stand on the board, trying not to sneeze. In England, Prime Minister Churchill, resurrected from retirement like an aging rock star, gives speeches about safety through deterrence, which is basically saying, "We'll keep the peace by holding the trigger halfway down." The audience applauds because clapping feels safer than thinking. You wander next through the Nevada test site, the desert shaking beneath your shoes. Reporters in fedoras scribble notes as shockwaves roll across sand flats. Military jeeps kick up dust that glitters like powdered bone. Scientists with clipboards nod appreciatively at their explosions, the way gardeners admire blooming flowers. Someone shouts, "Beautiful yield," and you can't tell whether he means data or detonation. In the distance, mannequins stand in model houses to test survivability, a morbid suburban diorama dubbed Doomtown. After each blast, inspectors record which brand of refrigerator stayed upright longest. It's capitalism's strangest science fair. Meanwhile, ordinary people adapt. In Los Angeles, a couple installs a Geiger counter next to the jukebox. In Leningrad, families practice evacuation drills that begin with the phrase, "Comrades, this is not a test," though everyone knows it is. The world becomes an enormous stage play titled Maybe Tomorrow. The sound design features sirens and silence in equal measure. You listen, half expecting applause that never comes. Then comes the H-bomb, and suddenly Hiroshima looks like a prequel. The United States detonates Ivy Mike in 1952, vaporizing an island and creating a new one made entirely of coral dust. Soviet scientists, not to be outdone, unleash their own monster 2 years later. The arms race no longer feels metaphorical. It's a marathon with no finish line, only increasingly expensive shoes. The quirky anecdote that flutters through the archives: when Edward Teller proposed even bigger bombs, one physicist asked whether there was a practical limit to destructive power. Teller supposedly replied, "Only budgetary." And scholars today still argue whether the hydrogen bomb era represented genuine scientific curiosity or bureaucratic momentum masquerading as destiny. You suspect it was both, because humans rarely separate fascination from danger for long. By 1955, the skies themselves become contested territory. The United States launches spy balloons over the USSR under the coded name Project Genetrix, which sounds like a detergent for existential dread. Soviet farmers find deflated specimens in their fields and hang them on barns like trophies. Each side insists the other started it. Historians later agree that both were simply bored. That same year, the British conduct the first live broadcast of an atomic test, announcing it on the BBC between a gardening show and cricket scores. Civilization, apparently, is about learning to schedule annihilation. Your ASMR senses tune in to subtler sounds: the clicking of Geiger counters, the shuffle of classified documents, the murmur of parents tucking children into basement bunks. The Cold War has acquired a rhythm, Heartbeat, countdown, heartbeat, countdown. You picture scientists calculating fallout trajectories while listening to jazz, because even Apocalypse benefits from a good bass line. Over in the Soviet Union, composers write symphonies about peaceful atoms, performed by orchestras that occasionally have to pause when nearby test sites rumble. You smile softly. Art always insists on existing, even when everything else trembles. Then comes 1957. Sputnik 1 rises into orbit, a shiny metal grapefruit that beeps mankind into a new age. It's technically about space, but emotionally it's about power. Americans stand in backyards staring at the night sky, realizing the Soviets have just placed a glowing reminder above their heads that physics doesn't recognize borders. Schools panic, Congress panics, and somewhere a principal cancels recess for national security reasons. The mainstream fact: Sputnik's success directly leads to the creation of NASA within a year. The quirky tidbit: some American newspapers briefly suggested that Sputnik's radio signal might be it broadcasting propaganda in Morse code. One even printed a fake translation that read, "Comrades, look up, we're winning." Scholars still debate whether Sputnik truly began the space race or merely revealed that it had already been running invisibly for years. Either way, the sky has joined the competition. At ground level, paranoia matures into policy. The United States builds NORAD's mountain fortress in Colorado, a literal panic room carved into granite, designed to survive anything except its own electric bill. The Soviet Union constructs underground command bunkers lined with velvet curtains because apparently class struggle still requires interior design. You descend a metaphorical elevator into these sanctuaries and notice how similar they feel. Same recycled air, same maps glowing with potential disaster, same coffee gone cold from waiting for Armageddon to RSVP. Generals on both sides develop a new vocabulary: escalation ladder, first strike, collateral damage. Each phrase sounds clinical enough to hide its heartbeat. You can almost hear language blushing. The quirky cultural cross-pollination continues. American comic books introduce superheroes who gain powers from radiation. Soviet posters feature workers glowing with productivity. Everyone, it seems, agrees that exposure builds character. Children trade toy missiles the way earlier generations traded marbles. And yet, amid the absurdity, the real human fear seeps through, that somewhere someone will sneeze near a launch button. Psychologists coin new disorders like nuclear neurosis, proving once again that modern civilization will always find a way to monetize its panic. You drift through the early 1960s as sirens wail during nationwide drills. In New York, office workers file calmly into basements, clutching handbags in existential dread. In Moscow, loudspeakers announce preparedness days, reminding citizens that readiness is patriotic, even if comprehension isn't. The world begins to dream in acronyms: ICBM, SLBM, we're mad. Each abbreviation feels like a spell meant to keep reality away. Somewhere in all this, theologians debate whether nuclear deterrence can be considered a form of collective sin. Economists counter that it's full employment for fear. You exhale slowly and let the absurd serenity of mutual terror lull you. And yet, innovation sprouts like weeds through concrete. Nuclear energy promises a cheap electricity, clean cities, utopian futures powered by the same force that haunts nightmares. The mainstream fact: by 1960, dozens of nations had signed agreements for civilian reactors, convinced atoms could be domesticated. The quirky historical twist: a beauty pageant in Idaho once crowned Miss Atomic Power. complete with a tiara shaped like a mushroom cloud. The debate that endures is whether civilian nuclear programs were genuine hope or merely camouflage for arms proliferation. You picture humanity applying lipstick to an atom and calling it progress. Across oceans, voices of dissent rise. Scientists, priests, poets, all whispering that perhaps survival shouldn't depend on perfect paranoia. In 1961, the movement gains its first anthem when Bob Dylan hums, "A hard rain's a-gonna fall," though some listeners think it's about weather. In the same year, the Soviets detonate the Tsar Bomba, the largest explosion in human history. So, bright pilots, flying hundreds of kilometers away, claim to see their bones through their hands. You stare at the description and feel your pulse slow to a tremor. The quirky footnote. The bomb was intentionally reduced to 50 megaton yield because the original design risked shattering windows in Moscow. Even the apocalypse has zoning laws. Scholars still debate whether the test was a strategic message or just a very expensive fireworks display for Khrushchev's ego. Either way, it worked. The planet's collective heartbeat skipped several bars. Soon afterward, the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis brings the dread into living color. For 13 days, the world holds its breath so tightly you can hear continents creak. Radios speak in euphemisms, newscasters sweat, and schoolchildren recite geography like last rites. The mainstream fact everyone remembers. Kennedy and Khrushchev negotiated a secret trade. Soviet missiles leave Cuba, American missiles leave Turkey, proving that mutual embarrassment can be an excellent survival strategy. The quirky corner of that story: a Soviet submarine commander, Vasily Arkhipov, reportedly refused to authorize a nuclear launch during the standoff, preventing the unthinkable. He later retired quietly with no parade, just a planet that owed him its continued existence. Historians still debate whether the crisis taught leaders caution or simply refined their poker faces. You lean back, exhale, and note that bedtime stories rarely get this close to ending early. After the crisis, a strange calm settles. The calm of people who've peeked over the cliff and decided to install guardrails instead of moving. Hotlines are built, treaties signed, test bans drafted. You picture diplomats shaking hands with the weariness of marathon runners who realize the finish line keeps walking away. The Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963 becomes the century's equivalent of promising to stop yelling indoors. Progress, perhaps, but still within hearing distance of madness. The quirky symbol of the era. Glow-in-the-dark peace signs, fashionable among youth who recognize irony when they see it. The ongoing academic quarrel. Did détente truly relax global tension, or just shift it into more polite conversation topics? Scholars debated it at conferences held in hotels equipped with fallout shelters, which feels poetically consistent. As night deepens in this narrative, you wander through an abandoned fallout shelter somewhere in the American Midwest. The canned goods have expired, the board games gather dust, and the walls still bear posters reading, "Keep calm, keep quiet." You run your fingers over the cool concrete and listen to the echo of generations rehearsing for disasters that never arrived. There's something almost comforting about the futility, as if building the shelter was less about surviving and more about proving we were trying. You picture a family descending those steps decades ago. Father with a clipboard, mother with a casserole, children with flashlights. And you realize the Cold War's true inheritance wasn't fear, but ritual. Humanity learned to prepare for the end as a kind of community service. Outside, the wind sighs through telephone wires, sounding eerily like that distant civil defense siren still testing itself once a month, just in case. You gaze up at the night sky, aware that thousands of warheads still orbit patience and pride. Somewhere a radar screen blinks, somewhere a satellite listens, and somewhere else, two old veterans share a drink and admit they were both terrified the whole time. The Cold War's nuclear age never truly ended, simply moved into our metaphors. Data clouds, digital firewalls, passwords called security. You smile softly, because bedtime history always ends the same way. Humanity survives another chapter, mostly by accident and partly by habit. The hum of reactors, the whisper of treaties, the faint echo of that duck and cover tune fade together into a steady lullaby of vigilance. And, as you drift into the next section, you realize the world's most dangerous weapon was never uranium. It was imagination that refused to rest. You wake to a quieter kind of battlefield now. One fought not with tanks or treaties but with whispers, code names, and the rustle of classified envelopes sliding across polished desks. It's the 1950s through the 1970s, and espionage has replaced heroism as humanity's favorite spectator sport. You're standing in a world where every diplomat suspects the gardener, every elevator button might be a microphone, and every friendship could be a front-page scandal waiting to develop. Even silence feels rehearsed. The mainstream fact grounding this strange new landscape is that during the height of the Cold War, both the CIA and the KGB employed tens of thousands of agents worldwide, an invisible army whose combined budgets rivaled small nations. The quirky truth no one at the cocktail party admits is that a shocking number of these spies were absolutely terrible at their jobs. Double agents who forgot their cover names, couriers who left microfilm in laundromats, and one British operative who was caught because he kept using his real tailor. And the enduring scholarly debate, the one whispered over conference room coffee, is whether all this espionage actually changed history or merely provided dramatic background music for events that would have happened anyway. You step into this haze of paranoia and perfume, and decide to find out. London first. The rain, as usual, performs a convincing impression of secrecy. You duck into a pub near Whitehall where men with briefcases sip gin like it's an oath. Somewhere beneath your feet, MI6 headquarters hums with the energy of moral gymnastics, how to defend democracy by occasionally lying through one's teeth. The bartender turns up the radio. A Sinatra tune drowns out the sound of a typewriter upstairs where someone is redacting adjectives for national security. You glance at the man in the trench coat beside you. His newspaper has two eye holes neatly cut out. You pretend not to notice. He pretends not to be obvious. That's the essence of the era. Performance art funded by paranoia. Across the channel, French intelligence passes baguettes with blueprints baked inside. In Moscow, the KGB trains agents to mimic Western slang so convincingly that one reportedly tried to order a cheeseburger in a restaurant that didn't serve food. Espionage has become both science and slapstick. Your ASMR senses tune into the tiny sounds that powered global tension, the click of hidden cameras, the snip of film canisters, the steady drip of coffee in fluorescent offices that never close. The first true celebrity spies emerge, people like Kim Philby, master of betrayal and impeccable tweed, whose very name sounds like a brand of guilt. The Cambridge 5 scandal unspools like a noir film. Upper-class British boys turn Soviet informants, proving that ideology sometimes hides behind perfect accents. The mainstream historians treat it as a cautionary tale of class arrogance. The quirky sidebar is that one of them, Guy Burgess, allegedly smuggled his pet dachshund out of England, disguised as diplomatic baggage. Scholars still debate whether the Cambridge 5 actually tipped the scales of Cold War intelligence, or just embarrass the linen service at Buckingham Palace. You sip your imaginary tea and decide the real casualty was British confidence itself. Meanwhile, the United States perfects espionage as corporate culture. Langley, Virginia becomes the world's most secure office park. Inside, agents file expense reports for poison pens and exploding cigars, all itemized under research. The CIA's Project MK Ultra experiments with mind control using LSD. Because nothing says professionalism like dosing your coworker to see if truth serum tastes citrusy. The mainstream fact: the program ran from the early 1950s until the mid-1970s, sanctioned by multiple directors, producing more paranoia than results. The fringe footnote: one Canadian hospital unwittingly participated, subjecting patients to weeks of sensory deprivation for science. The scholarly debate that lingers, unsettling as the echo in an empty corridor, is whether these experiments were a symptom of genuine scientific curiosity or simply the logical end of a bureaucracy that had lost its sense of reality. You imagine an entire government on acid, asking the cosmos for budget justification. Across the ocean, the KGB answers every Western stunt with equal creativity. Dead drops hidden in hollow tree trunks, listening devices disguised as cufflinks, cyanide pills tucked into fountain pens. It's less James Bond and more obsessive scrapbooking with fatal consequences. In Berlin, a tunnel code named Operation Gold stretches beneath Soviet sectors so Western agents can tap phone lines. The mainstream fact: the KGB already knew about it, having been tipped off by British double agent George Blake, but let the tunnel run for years just to feed the CIA false information. The quirky, almost cinematic twist: Blake claimed he acted out of moral conviction, convinced that socialism was the future, though skeptics suggest he simply liked the attention. Historians still argue whether Operation Gold was a strategic failure or a psychological masterpiece, an espionage version of letting your opponent cheat just to see what they'll copy wrong. Every major city grows its own rumor ecosystem. Washington, D.C. hums with cocktail party gossip that could topple governments. Moscow whispers with the hush of snow muffling dissent. You stroll through both simultaneously, slipping between realities like a bilingual conscience. In one, CIA Director Alan Dulles insists democracy requires covert action in defense of openness. In the other, KGB Chairman Yuri Andropov calmly explains that truth is what survives interrogation. Two philosophies, same insomnia. The air between them crackles with unspoken admiration. They are mirror imagers pretending not to notice. The 1960 U-2 incident turns the sky itself into a crime scene. American pilot Francis Gary Powers is shot down over Soviet territory. His wreckage paraded through Moscow like evidence in a cosmic trial. The mainstream fact: Eisenhower's administration first denies the plane's purpose, then confesses when the Soviets produce the pilot alive and the camera intact. The quirky aftermath: souvenir fragments of the U-2 were later sold in Moscow street markets as capitalist scrap, proof that entrepreneurship transcends ideology. The debate endures: was the flight necessary intelligence gathering or reckless provocation? Either way, the sky got smaller afterward. Everyone began glancing up before making phone calls. Espionage trickles into pop culture like ink bleeding through paper. Hollywood, always eager to monetize tension, releases Dr. No in 1962, turning secrecy into chic. Somewhere, a real spy sighs into his martini because his life is mostly paperwork, not Aston Martins. Soviet audiences get their own glamorous countermyth: 17 Moments of Spring, a television saga about a noble KGB officer infiltrating the Nazis. Proof that even propaganda loves good lighting. You grin softly. Art again does what diplomacy cannot. It humanizes the paranoia. Children on both sides grow up pretending to be spies, learning that secrecy feels powerful until it becomes lonely. By the 1970s, espionage evolves from cloak and dagger to plug and socket. Satellites orbit above, clicking pictures of everything except the truth. Analysts on both sides stare at grainy images of trucks and argue whether they're missiles or tractors. The mainstream fact: reconnaissance satellites like Corona and Zenit captured millions of photographs, fundamentally altering military intelligence. The quirky tidbit: early U.S. film capsules literally parachuted from orbit and were caught mid-air by planes, a process described by one pilot as trying to catch a safe with a butterfly net. Scholars still debate whether the shift to high-tech spying made the world safer through transparency or more paranoid through precision. You watch the glowing dots cross the night sky and realize that privacy has officially become vintage. Inside embassies, typewriters clatter like nervous teeth. Coded cables describe emotions in bureaucratic syntax. Regret to inform. Ally may be compromised. Somewhere, an agent burns his notes in a hotel sink while humming a Beatles tune. The cultural invasion proving harder to contain than any secret. In Prague Spring 1968, the CIA and KGB both scramble to interpret student protests. Each claims the other started them, though historians later agree the cause was simply the human craving for sunlight. The quirky micro-story. One Czech radio operator broadcast Beatles songs as signals of freedom, confusing Western listeners who thought it was coded intel. The open debate that continues in political theory seminars: can information itself be weaponized without corrupting the very societies it claims to protect? Judging by every news cycle since, the answer is probably yes repeatedly. You pause for breath in Vienna, that polite espionage capital where every second taxi driver seems to work for somebody's intelligence service. Café Central serves pastries dusted with suspicion. You imagine agents trading microfilm inside strudels. Austria's neutrality makes it the world's waiting room, filled with people who can't admit why they're there. The waiter refills your coffee without asking questions, an underrated survival skill. Across town, the International Atomic Energy Agency holds conferences on peaceful uses of nuclear power, while half the attendees carry diplomatic pouches large enough to hide moral compromise. The Cold War has matured into bureaucracy, espionage, into etiquette. By the 1980s, technology turns every desk into a listening post. Tiny recorders nested in pens, telephones, even toasters. The West installs fiber optics. The East perfects human optics. Agents who can read lips from a mile away. The CIA develops satellite communication so advanced that, rumor has it, one operative once ordered pizza through a secure line just to prove he could. The mainstream fact: espionage spending in both blocks peaks around 1985, consuming billions annually. The quirky cultural echo: spy gadget catalogs briefly outsell fashion magazines. And the scholarly debate that still hums beneath it all is whether the intelligence community's sheer volume of data ever compensated for its chronic misunderstanding of people. Machines could count tanks. They couldn't read intentions. Then, without warning, the walls begin to tremble. Not from bombs, but from boredom. The Berlin Wall will soon crumble. Yet the spy networks remain entangled like headphones in a pocket. Agents who spent decades trading secrets now trade resumes. Some defect, some retire. Some start consulting firms because espionage turns out to be transferable to marketing. You walk through the newly opened checkpoints of 1989 and sense history exhaling. The mainstream fact: thousands of Stasi files were discovered in East Germany, meticulously documenting every whisper. The quirky find: one folder recorded the sound of a couple arguing about whose turn it was to buy bread. Proof that tyranny, like marriage, leaves detailed minutes. The debate that persists is whether the surveillance state collapsed from moral fatigue or simply lost track of its own paperwork. You wander through the archives now, rows of steel cabinets, smells of dust and ink. Each folder hums faintly, like an old radio still picking up frequencies from the past. You realize espionage was never just about nations. It was about curiosity gone feral, the human need to know even what shouldn't be known. Beneath the code names and ciphers lies a universal confession. Everyone wants to feel important in someone else's story. You can almost hear the sigh of retired agents watching Bond reruns, whispering, "It wasn't really like that," though secretly wishing it had been. And as you leave this dimly lit chapter, you notice that the Cold War's great secret wasn't hidden in any vault, it was hiding in plain sight. The real espionage happened in hearts, lovers concealing doubts, citizens pretending loyalty, leaders disguising fear as strategy. The world became fluent in double meanings, and even today we still speak the language of plausible deniability. The typewriter keys fade, the microphones fall silent, and the planet for a brief drowsy moment remembers how to trust the sound of its own breathing. You walk through a city that still smells faintly of ashes and aftershave, a city that shouldn't exist and yet refuses not to. It's Berlin in the 1950s and 1960s, a scar-turned monument, a place where the Cold War gets tired of metaphors and builds itself in brick and barbed wire. Streets still bear names from empires long gone, but now they double as checkpoints for ideology. One half sells jazz records and chewing gum, the other half sells unity and potatoes. You can almost hear history whispering, "Pick a side but make it quick." The mainstream fact anchoring this fractured dream is that in August 1961, East German authorities, backed by Moscow, erected the Berlin Wall overnight, a 96-mile barrier of concrete, wire, and watchtowers that split families, friendships, and grocery lists in two. The quirky truth, documented in later archives, is that some Berliners initially thought the soldiers stringing barbed wire through streets were setting up for a parade. By the time they realized otherwise, the city had been surgically divided, and the open scholarly debate that endures like a low hum beneath the cobblestones is whether the wall was primarily an act of containment to stop East Germans from fleeing, or an act of performance meant to prove to the world that socialism could physically outlast doubt. You stroll along Unter den Linden, half in shadow, half in sunlight, and think it's probably both. Fear rarely builds such neat geometry without vanity mixed in. In the first days after the wall's birth, confusion reigns. Subway lines that once crossed the city are abruptly sealed. Trains stop mid-tunnel, their passengers blinking into emergency lights. A grandmother in wedding wakes to discover her sister in Friedrichshain now lives in a different country without moving an inch. Lovers wave across fences while soldiers take photos for their reports. You watch one woman toss her handbag over the wire to a friend before realizing she can't follow it. The handbag lands safely in capitalism. She does not. American news crews arrive within hours, broadcasting the surreal image of a divided city to the world. Walter Cronkite sighs on live television, as if narration itself can't quite handle the absurdity. The sound of shovels digging post holes becomes Berlin's new lullaby. Life adapts quickly because it has to. In the West, cafes rename themselves Freedom Coffee and sell anti-communist croissants, which taste suspiciously normal. In the East, propaganda posters blossom overnight, workers smiling beside cheerful slogans like "The wall protects our peace." You can't help but smile. Nothing says tranquility like a 12-foot barrier topped with glass shards. Yet behind the irony, exhaustion grows. Both sides develop rituals of defiance. In the West, people climb observation platforms to wave to relatives across the divide. In the East, children are told not to look toward the decadent zone. You stand somewhere between those two gazes, realizing that the wall isn't just blocking roads, it's blocking imaginations. The mainstream detail that never stops astonishing you is the exodus that preceded the wall. Nearly 3 million East Germans fled to the West between 1949 and 1961, often through Berlin's porous border. That's roughly 1 in 6 citizens, a human leak so embarrassing that even concrete started to look like a solution. The quirky side note: on the wall's first night, dozens of East Berlin bricklayers accidentally built their section facing the wrong direction, prompting frantic supervisors to turn them around before sunrise. It's a small reminder that totalitarian efficiency still obeys Murphy's Law. Scholars continue to debate whether East Germany could have survived economically without sealing its population, or whether the wall merely delayed an inevitable collapse. You decide. It doesn't matter. History doesn't grant refunds, only receipts. Over time, the wall grows layers, literal and psychological. Guard towers rise, floodlights hum, and a narrow death strip of sand and mines stretches like an ugly moat through the city's center. Soldiers patrol with dogs. Pigeons watch indifferently from rooftops. In the west, artists begin painting the concrete, turning gray slabs into canvases of rebellion. One mural depicts a man peering through a keyhole, another shows a mouth swallowing barbed wire. East Berlin, of course, can't see them. You notice how irony always migrates westward, perhaps because sarcasm requires oxygen. You step into a smoky bar in Kreuzberg, 1964. Jazz fills the room like steam, and conversation hums with restlessness. American soldiers off duty buy drinks for German students who debate existentialism in borrowed English. Outside, the neon glow from West Berlin's department stores bleeds faintly through the wall, an accidental light show for anyone watching from the darker side. Over in East Berlin, an engineer named Horst imagines tunneling beneath it, his fingers tracing blueprints he'll never dare show. You can almost hear him digging in his sleep. The mainstream fact: at least 70 tunnels were attempted during the wall's lifetime, some successful, many not. The quirky gem: one tunnel operation was financed by an American television network, NBC, which planned to film the escape as an exclusive. When politics intervened, they broadcast a dramatized version instead, proving that capitalism always finds a story, even when reality declines to cooperate. The academic argument that still divides historians: did these tunnels represent genuine defiance or Western performance art disguised as bravery? You suspect the diggers themselves didn't care. Freedom, like oxygen, justifies any method of inhalation. Through the 1960s, Berlin becomes both cage and stage. Western musicians play concerts near the wall, loud enough for Eastern ears. The Rolling Stones supposedly trigger a small riot when their songs drift over the border. Teenagers press radios against their windows to catch forbidden frequencies, whispering English lyrics like prayers. In the East, cultural committees issue decrees banning decadent sounds, a phrase that manages to make rebellion sound delicious. The quirky footnote: when American soul records became contraband, East German engineers tried to create approved socialist jazz, which mostly sounded like optimism played on a clarinet. Scholars today argue whether such cultural control preserved stability or simply guaranteed boredom. Then comes 1963, and a familiar voice echoes through the city: John F. Kennedy, standing before the Rathaus Schöneberg, declaring "Ich bin ein Berliner." The crowd roars, though some locals giggle because his grammar makes it sound like he's calling himself a jelly donut. The mainstream historical point: his speech becomes an anthem of solidarity, a line that cements the West's moral claim to the city. The quirky anecdote that follows him forever: bakeries across Germany sell Berliner pastries for weeks afterward under the slogan, "We are all jelly donuts." And in the scholarly debate that still sneaks into footnotes is whether Kennedy's symbolism truly strengthened morale or merely romanticized a stalemate no one intended to end. You decide. It was both, because hope, even when clumsy, still tastes sweet. Through the 1970s, the wall grows taller, thicker, more paranoid. Floodlights multiply. Machine gun nests appear. The death strip becomes a manicured desert. But life, stubborn as ever, seeps through the cracks. Postal workers find ways to sneak letters hidden inside hollowed-out books. West Berlin students launch helium balloons carrying love notes and Rolling Stones lyrics. East Berliners respond by building model airplanes that drop sarcastic leaflets back over. It's a Cold War correspondence course taught by gravity. The quirky, almost cinematic scene. One East German soldier defected by driving a stolen tank straight through the barrier, reportedly honking as he went. Scholars still debate whether his act inspired courage or simply better reinforced concrete afterward. You stroll now along the Brandenburg Gate, closed, chained, and heavily guarded. Once the symbol of Prussian triumph, it now resembles a haunted archway, where ghosts queue politely. The wind carries distant echoes, speeches, sirens, laughter swallowed by distance. You realize Berlin has become a metaphor so powerful it forgets it's also a postal code. Western journalists call it the front line of freedom. Eastern pamphlets call it the bastion of socialism, and Berliners themselves just call it home. Somewhere, a cat sits on the wall, unimpressed by ideology. By the 1980s, cracks appear. Not in concrete yet, but in conviction. Television signals from the West bleed into East Berlin apartments, delivering sitcoms and commercials for things no one can buy. A child grows up knowing the theme song to Dallas but never seeing a cowboy. The mainstream fact. By 1985, at least 90% of East Berlin households could receive Western broadcasts despite government jamming. The quirky tidbit. Some state technicians secretly adjusted antennas to improve reception for themselves, proving that hypocrisy, too, is a universal language. The scholarly question that lingers. Did exposure to Western media undermine the East's legitimacy more effectively than any spy or diplomat? The consensus is yes, and television remains the most patient revolutionary of them all. Then comes 1989. A year so strange it feels like the calendar itself stumbled. Crowds gather, rumors spread, and a bureaucratic miscommunication. An East German spokesman reading the wrong memo at a press conference accidentally announces that travel restrictions are lifted immediately. The border guards, uncertain whether to shoot or salute, choose neither. People flood the checkpoints, laughter breaking like thunder. Within hours, the wall that took years to build is being dismantled by hand, chunk by chunk, hammer by hammer. The mainstream fact, it wasn't a planned reform, just human improvisation on a global stage. The quirky, beautiful irony. Souvenir hunters sold pieces of the wall at flea markets weeks later, meaning capitalism literally digested communism one brick at a time. Scholars still debate who caused the fall. Gorbachev's reforms, Western diplomacy, or sheer exhaustion. But you sense the real answer is simpler. No wall can survive generations that outgrow its logic. You stand now amid the rubble, the night alive with champagne, tears, and borrowed guitars. Someone spray paints Wir sind ein Volk. We are one people across the last standing section, then bursts into song so off-key it could melt ideology faster than acid rain. A woman in her 70s touches the graffiti, whispering that she hasn't seen her sister in 28 years. Behind her, an American tourist cheers and tries to buy a brick. The Cold War, for one surreal evening, feels like it has a sense of humor. The next morning, Berlin wakes to the sound of hammers still tapping, not as destruction but as heartbeat. You walk along the now porous border, hearing birdsong for the first time in decades unbroken by gunfire. Sunlight filters through rebar, gilding the ruins like cathedral windows. You realize the wall was never just concrete. It was collective exhaustion poured into solid form. Its fall isn't the end of the Cold War, merely the start of its echo. But for tonight, that echo is soft, almost lullaby-like. The sigh of a city learning to breathe evenly again. You wake to the sound of a television test pattern humming somewhere between fear and fashion. the static lullaby of a nation convinced that communism might be hiding in the wallpaper. It's the late 1940s through the 1950s in America, the era historians later nicknamed the Red Scare, but to you it feels more like a collective panic attack with better lighting. You walk down a sunny suburban street where lawns are clipped to military precision and curtains twitch whenever the mailman hesitates too long at a door. Somewhere, a dog barks in Morse code, or maybe that's just what paranoia sounds like when it finds rhythm. The mainstream fact anchoring this era of anxiety is that by 1950 Senator Joseph McCarthy had risen to national fame through a series of hearings accusing thousands of Americans, artists, teachers, journalists, even soldiers of communist sympathies, often with no evidence stronger than an unfortunate acquaintance. The quirky fact that usually gets buried under the hysteria, McCarthy's original list of traitors allegedly contained 205 names scribbled on an old cocktail napkin, proving that even witch hunts need stationery. And the enduring scholarly debate, still politely quarreled over in university hallways, is whether the Red Scare actually protected American democracy or quietly undermined it by teaching citizens that suspicion was the highest form of patriotism. You take a deep breath, smell the combination of cigarette smoke and newly invented aerosol deodorant, and realize you're standing in a country where everyone wants to be clean, even their conscience. Inside living rooms glowing with black and white optimism, families watch government-approved television programs about wholesome neighbors and loyal sons, unaware that the screen itself is part of a quiet battle. Hollywood studios, terrified of blacklisting, begin purging anyone whose politics smell vaguely European. Writers sign loyalty oaths. Directors add extra flags to sets just in case the camera misses their sincerity. You imagine the pitch meetings. Can we make the alien invasion movie more patriotic? Sure, we'll have the monster defeated by capitalism. The mainstream fact of film history. In 1951, I Was a Communist for the FBI received an Academy Award nomination, turning propaganda into popcorn. The quirky fringe story. One real-life FBI informant later admitted he exaggerated his heroics because being boring didn't sell tickets. The academic debate that endures is whether 1950s American cinema was truly patriotic or simply performing fear in Technicolor. You smile softly. Either way, the popcorn still tasted like buttered anxiety. Beyond Hollywood, the paranoia trickles into classrooms. Teachers pledge allegiance louder than usual, and high school civics lessons begin sounding like field manuals for ideological hygiene. In Washington, congressional committees host televised interrogations so dramatic that some Americans cancel evening plans to watch professors explain their reading habits. You picture families gathered around their sets whispering, "He looks guilty of literature." Outside, even librarians feel nervous. Certain novels disappear from shelves under the noble banner of national security. Somewhere, a teenage bookworm discovers that Rebellion now comes printed in paperback. The air itself grows serious. Radios hum patriotic jingles between weather reports and church sermons blend seamlessly into anti-communist lectures as though salvation and capitalism are now part of the same product bundle. And yet, in the same decade, something entirely different starts slipping through customs: blue jeans, jazz, and the seductive notion that culture travels faster than politics. You drift into an East European city, Warsaw maybe, or Budapest, where teenagers trade Western records in alleys and sew contraband denim into their uniforms. The blue jean becomes an unofficial flag of quiet rebellion, stitched together from longing and American cotton. The mainstream fact. Levi's jeans became so coveted behind the Iron Curtain that entire black markets emerged, and Soviet customs officers were instructed to confiscate them as symbols of capitalist corruption. The quirky tidbit. One Soviet tailor in the 1960s tried to recreate jeans using repurposed prison uniforms. The result was so stiff it could stand upright without a wearer, earning the nickname Lenin's Revenge. The open debate among cultural historians remains whether Western consumer goods genuinely eroded communist ideology or merely gave it something comfortable to complain about. You think of it this way: revolutions may start with manifestos, but they often end with wardrobe malfunctions. Back in the United States, consumerism becomes the new national religion. Supermarkets bloom like temples, their aisles stacked with canned confidence. Buy American transforms from slogan to moral commandment. You wander through a Sears catalog that reads suspiciously like scripture, the gospel according to refrigeration. But beneath the abundance, unease simmers. Every friendly handshake carries the faint question, "Are you one of us?" And every denial sounds a little rehearsed. Even children absorb the script in playgrounds. Rumors spread about classmates whose parents read the Daily Worker. Patriotism becomes contagious, but so does accusation, and the two viruses prove hard to distinguish. Across the ocean, Soviet citizens watch this consumer spectacle with fascination and envy. Western goods seep through borders via black market traders and diplomatic luggage. A single pair of imported Levi's might trade for a month's salary, while a Beatles record, illegal, irresistible, passes from hand to hand like contraband hope. You walk through a smoky Moscow dormitory in the 1970s and hear young engineers whispering lyrics phonetically learned from bootlegs. The mainstream fact: by the mid-1970s, Western pop music had become so popular that the USSR created state-sanctioned official rock bands to offer safer rhythms. The quirky gem: some entrepreneurs pressed forbidden albums onto discarded X-ray film, selling bone records that glowed ghostly images of rib cages when held to light. The scholarly debate that still hums under neon nostalgia is whether cultural infiltration like this constituted soft power or just human curiosity refusing to stay in mono. You suspect it was both. Art rarely asks permission before crossing a border. Meanwhile, back home, McCarthy's crusade burns too bright to last. The televised Army McCarthy hearings of 1954 expose his bluster for what it is: theater without a plot. "Have you no sense of decency, sir?" a lawyer finally asks, and the question lands like a gavel. Within months, McCarthy's star implodes under the gravity of his own spotlight. The mainstream fact: the Senate formally censured him that December, ending his reign of televised terror. The quirky aftertaste: souvenir vendors outside the Capitol reportedly sold anti-communist coffee mugs with handles shaped like little hammers and sickles, proof that even scandal can be merchandised. Scholars still debate whether McCarthyism died that year or simply mutated into subtler forms of suspicion. The cameras turned off, but the habit of fear remained syndicated. The cultural pendulum, though, keeps swinging. By the late 1950s, youth culture starts rebelling, not through manifestos but through rhythm. Elvis shakes his hips on national TV and inadvertently performs geopolitical satire. The West's first weaponized pelvis. Churches frown, parents panic, teenagers cheer. Somewhere in Moscow, a party official watches a smuggled clip of Jailhouse Rock and mutters, "This is how empires fall." He's not entirely wrong. The mainstream fact: American music exports quadrupled during the decade, earning more international revenue than steel. The quirky trivia: East German authorities once staged a counter-Elvis festival featuring accordion ensembles playing polkas about tractor efficiency. Historians still debate which was more subversive, the leather jacket or the accordion. You suspect history quietly votes for the jacket. Inside American homes, the paranoia that once aimed outward turns inward. Neighbors monitor each other for un-American activities. A phrase so vague it could include eating French cheese. The FBI compiles dossiers thick enough to block sunlight. Even Einstein ends up with one, proving that theoretical physics is no defense against bureaucratic curiosity. Yet amid all the finger-pointing, something unexpected happens. Irony is born. Comedians start joking about the hysteria. Jazz musicians improvise defiance, and writers slip satire past censors disguised as allegory. You realize humor becomes democracy's pressure valve. If you can laugh at fear, it loses some of its calories. Then, as decades turn, the Red Scare dissolves into Cold War routine, and America's greatest export becomes not ideology but aesthetics. Coca-Cola bubbles in every continent. Hollywood teaches the world how optimism should sound. Soviet propagandists grumble that the West conquers through style, yet secretly sip contraband Pepsi at embassy receptions. The mainstream fact: in 1972, PepsiCo struck a trade deal with the USSR, making it the first American consumer product officially sold there. The quirky outcome: payment came partly in vodka and, later, in a fleet of Soviet warships traded as scrap metal. The scholarly debate that still entertains economists was that capitalism's ultimate victory, or just a glorified barter deal with extra carbonation. You grin. It's hard not to toast history when it's this fizzy. By now, the world's contrasts have blurred into one shared absurdity. In Los Angeles, students read Marx ironically in coffee houses. In Leningrad, engineers hum along to disco imported through Finland. Ideologies that once threatened annihilation now coexist awkwardly in people's wardrobes. You picture an East German teenager wearing a Che Guevara shirt under a denim jacket, a contradiction so perfect it might be art. The wall still stands, but culture walks right through it wearing sneakers. You think back to that cocktail napkin list that started the panic and realize how small it seems compared to the size of human curiosity. Fear builds fences. Curiosity sells tickets. As you drift toward sleep in this section's twilight, you hear echoes from both worlds: the scratch of a vinyl record in an Eastern dormitory, the hiss of aerosol hairspray in a Western bathroom, both frequencies merging into one long exhale of the 20th century. The Red Scare fades into reruns, the jeans never go out of style, and the planet learns an awkward truth. Ideologies age, but fashion doesn't. Somewhere in the dark, someone hums a forbidden tune while ironing their denim, and for a moment the entire Cold War feels like background music for people trying to figure out who they are. The fear has cooled, but the rhythm lingers, steady and human, keeping time with the heartbeat of a world that, despite everything, keeps wanting to dance. You open your eyes to a sky that suddenly seems closer than it used to be, as if humanity has decided that the cure for fear is altitude. It's the late 1950s, and the Cold War has just discovered the cosmos. The Earth below hums with rival radio signals, and every child on the planet learns the same new word: Sputnik. You stand in an open field somewhere in Kansas, or maybe in the steppes of Kazakhstan, watching a silver bead drift across the night, beeping faintly like a cosmic metronome keeping time for two nervous superpowers. The mainstream fact anchoring this weightless rivalry is that on October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite, and with it the collective human ego into orbit. The quirky detail that makes it feel human again is that Soviet engineers reportedly fed the satellite's radio transmitter through a borrowed taxi battery during early tests. They were so worried about secrecy that they labeled the equipment weather research, as if the weather had suddenly become bilingual. And the open scholarly debate that still sparks conference panels is whether the space race was truly a scientific quest or simply nationalism with better lighting. You decide it was probably both, because in the end, curiosity and pride share the same rocket fuel. Within hours of Sputnik's launch, headlines scream like caffeinated prophets. In Washington, senators pace hallways muttering about missile gaps and technological humiliation. Parents buy telescopes not for the stars but to keep an eye on the sky, just in case ideology starts orbiting overhead. Teachers suddenly teach physics with patriotic urgency, and science fairs acquire a faint smell of jet fuel. You wander through a 1958 classroom where a poster reads "Knowledge is our shield," while the janitor discreetly replaces the old globe because someone discovered half the countries had changed names overnight. Fear and wonder have become identical twins, both wearing lab coats. Across the ocean in Moscow, pride crackles through radio static. The Soviets play the Internationale on loudspeakers outside the Kremlin, as if serenading the moon itself. Engineers celebrate with vodka and exhaustion, their hands still shaking from 12-hour shifts and decades of poverty. Ordinary citizens, too, glance skyward, murmuring that their nation has leapt ahead, not just militarily but spiritually. For a moment, communism feels transcendent, its faith validated by orbit, the mainstream fact. The United States responds within a year by creating NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, turning bureaucratic panic into institutional ambition. The quirky side note: one of NASA's early internal memos suggested designing uniforms for astronauts evoking heroic mythology, which briefly produced sketches featuring capes, proof that even engineers sometimes get carried away. Scholars still argue whether America's rapid mobilization was about scientific inspiration or simply the unbearable sting of being second in place at something visible from every backyard. You stroll now through a sleepy desert test range where rockets stand like enormous pencils waiting for a cosmic exam. The night smells of kerosene and nerves. Somewhere a coyote yelps, somewhere else a countdown begins. The launch tower trembles, flames bloom, and humanity's imagination lifts off again, this time with a Texan accent and congressional oversight. You feel the vibration under your feet, half awe, half tax dollars. Newspapers christen it the space age, and soon even vacuum cleaners are marketed as rocket-powered. The Cold War, it seems, has discovered branding. Behind the glamour, espionage continues to orbit. Each side spies on the other's launches, counting stages, measuring trajectories, reading meaning into exhaust plumes. You imagine Soviet analysts staring at grainy photos of Cape Canaveral, wondering if every palm tree hides an antenna. The Americans, equally curious, drop listening devices near Baikonur disguised as geological instruments because apparently geology now has strong opinions about communism. The mainstream fact: both nations routinely tracked each other's rockets using radar networks so vast they accidentally mapped parts of the moon before knowing what to do with the data. The quirky anecdote: U.S. intelligence once misidentified a Soviet rocket test as a potential UFO, sparking a brief internal memo titled "Extraterrestrial Ideological Contact," which nobody dared file under humor. And the scholarly debate that still drifts through academia: did Cold War surveillance accelerate scientific discovery, or merely prove how much paranoia weighs when launched into orbit? You suspect it did both. Fear, after all, is the universe's most renewable energy source. Then comes 1961, and with it a voice crackling through static. Poyakali, let's go. Yuri Gagarin, 27 years old and smiling like someone who hasn't been told he's about to become legend, becomes the first human in space. The world holds its breath for 108 minutes that stretch into eternity. The mainstream fact: Gagarin's capsule, Vostok 1, completes one full orbit before parachuting him safely back to Earth, making him instantly the most photographed man alive. The quirky trivia: he had to land separately from his spacecraft because early engineers hadn't yet mastered safe capsule re-entry, so technically he ejected and parachuted down into a potato field, where an astonished farmer offered him milk. Historians still debate whether Gagarin's flight marked a universal human triumph or a Soviet propaganda masterstroke disguised as humanity's. You watch him wave on grainy newsreels, his grin sincere enough to blur the difference. In America, the response is pure determination wrapped in envy. President Kennedy stands before Congress and declares that the United States will land a man on the moon before this decade is out. Applause erupts, Not because anyone knows how, but because the alternative is humiliation. Engineers at NASA glance nervously at calendars. Mathematicians sharpen pencils as if arming themselves for combat. The mainstream fact: the Apollo program eventually employs over 400,000 people, more than the population of some countries. The quirky side effect: one Florida town briefly renames itself Moonport to attract tourists, then changes it back after realizing space travelers rarely need motels. The debate that lingers like moon dust: was Kennedy's promise visionary courage or political theater to distract from earthly problems? You smile, because most great promises are both. The 1960s unfold like a rocket countdown measured in protest songs and slide rules. Astronauts become new mythic figures, Odysseus in oxygen helmets, while cosmonauts counter with perfect posture and propaganda smiles. American children eat space-age breakfast cereal. Soviet children memorize equations in honor of Sputnik's grandchildren. Somewhere in Houston, an engineer tapes a sign above his desk reading "Failure is not an option," while in Moscow, another scrawls the same sentiment in Cyrillic, proving that determination also ignores borders. You imagine the two would have been friends if only visas weren't classified. The space race fuels not only technology but imagination. Artists paint galaxies, novelists write utopias, and pop musicians turn gravity into metaphor. Yet fear never quite leaves orbit. The same rockets that reach the stars can deliver warheads. The same mathematicians who dream of Mars draft missile trajectories before lunch. The mainstream historical symmetry: every advancement in space propulsion coincides with a new generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles, progress and peril sharing the same blueprints. The quirky reflection: engineers at one U.S. base nicknamed their missile computer HATE-AL. Years before 2001, A Space Odyssey was released, only to rename it quietly when the film turned the joke sinister. Scholars still debate whether the space race genuinely advanced peace by uniting humanity in wonder or simply made the Cold War more expensive in zero gravity. You decide the verdict depends on altitude. From Earth it looked foolish, from orbit it looked divine. By 1969, the rivalry reaches its cinematic climax. The night of July 20th feels almost sacred. Televisions flicker across continents, drawing billions of eyes to a tiny gray horizon. That's one small step for man. Neil Armstrong murmurs, his voice calm enough to make silence weep. For a heartbeat, even Moscow listens without sarcasm. The mainstream fact: the Apollo 11 mission fulfills Kennedy's promise, planting a flag that flutters only because there's no wind to contradict it. The quirky legend: Armstrong's footprint is still visible today, perfectly preserved in lunar dust, an eternal monument to one man's excellent balance. The open debate among historians: was that moment humanity's shared triumph or America's final Cold War trophy? You sit beside the ghost of the TV audience, watching the astronauts bounce gently, and think maybe it doesn't matter. The moon didn't ask for allegiance. In the years that follow, cooperation cautiously replaces competition. 1975 brings the Apollo-Soyuz handshake, a literal clasp of hands between orbiting spacecrafts, American and Soviet astronauts grinning like cousins who finally admitted they're related. The mainstream fact: that mission marked the first international crewed spaceflight and paved the way for future collaboration. The quirky anecdote: engineers struggled to design a universal docking mechanism because neither side trusted the other's bolts. Eventually they agreed on an adapter nicknamed the Space Handshake. Scholars still debate whether the mission truly thawed relations or merely photographed détente from a better angle. You like to imagine that for at least one orbit, human beings stopped being nationalities and just floated. As the 70s dim into amber nostalgia, the space race leaves its souvenirs scattered across culture. Velcro shoes, freeze-dried ice cream, optimism with a side of jet noise. But beneath the memorabilia lies something gentler: perspective. The first photographs of Earth from space, fragile, blue, borderless, stun even cynics. Politicians see strategic insignificance. Poets see humility. The mainstream fact, the 1972 blue marble image becomes the most reproduced photograph in history. The quirky footnote, one astronaut reportedly carried an unauthorized cassette of Simon and Garfunkel and played Homeward Bound while orbiting, claiming later that the planet looked like the song sounded. Scholars still debate whether seeing Earth hold changed global consciousness or just provided better wallpaper for environmental conferences. You decide. The difference is minimal. Beauty rarely needs justification. Now, decades later, the beeps of Sputnik have faded into nostalgic rhythm, and the rockets rust quietly in museums. Yet the night sky still holds their echoes, each satellite a reminder that fear once aimed us upward and accidentally taught us wonder. You close your eyes and hear it. The soft static of distant transmissions, the sigh of solar wind brushing against old antennas, the faint heartbeat of a species that mistook competition for curiosity and somehow achieved both. In the hush that follows, you float between laughter and reverence, realizing that the space race's greatest discovery wasn't the moon or the stars. It was the fragile unity of looking up together just once and agreeing that the universe was worth the risk. You wake to the sound of clinking glasses and unspoken threats echoing across a polished table somewhere in New York City, inside a building designed to prevent the apocalypse by holding meetings about it. The year is 1960, and the Cold War has developed its own soundtrack. Diplomatic applause, camera shutters, and the occasional shoe slamming into wood. The mainstream fact at the center of this strange performance is that Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, during a United Nations General Assembly speech, banged his shoe on the desk to protest what he called Western arrogance. The quirky truth tucked behind the legend. Eyewitnesses later disagreed on whether he actually used his shoe or just waved it theatrically. But decades of political cartoons have permanently immortalized the footwear as a co-star in international relations. And the open scholarly debate that still clicks like a metronome through think tank corridors is whether Khrushchev's outburst was deliberate theater meant to impress allies back home, or a genuine flash of temper from a man who believed diplomacy should occasionally shout. You watch him grin afterward, his bald head gleaming under television lights, and you realize that in this era, charisma itself is a weapon, and Khrushchev has enough for 2 continents. Across the Atlantic, the United States is rehearsing its own performance of nerves and confidence. The year 1960 also brings the first televised presidential debates, and in living rooms across America, citizens squint at 2 men arguing politely about missiles, morality, and moisturizers. John F. Kennedy, young enough to seem untested, radiates composure that television loves. Richard Nixon, sweating under studio heat, looks like a man negotiating with his own pores. It's the first time optics outweigh rhetoric. The mainstream fact. Historians later agree that television viewers largely favored Kennedy, while radio listeners thought Nixon had won. Proof that the Cold War wasn't just ideological, it was photogenic. The quirky cultural echo. Makeup artists on set reportedly used powder meant for stage actors, giving both men an oddly luminous look that one producer later described as politically celestial. Scholars still debate whether the televised debate changed the election's outcome or simply revealed that charisma was the new currency of power. You think of Khrushchev's shoe again and smile. Apparently, performance had become a shared language, even between enemies. When Kennedy wins, the world collectively inhales. At 43, he becomes the youngest elected president in American history and the firstborn in the 20th century. The Kremlin regards him with the wary curiosity of a cat studying a laser pointer. Inexperienced, Khrushchev mutters, though you can hear the unspoken envy. Youth is a kind of propaganda too. The 2 men meet in Vienna in 1961, a summit that quickly devolves into a diplomatic fencing match conducted entirely in smiles. Kennedy hopes for cooperation. Khrushchev wants concession. They talk about Berlin, nuclear weapons, and the weather, each subject colder than the last. Kennedy later admits the meeting was the worst thing in my life. The mainstream fact: the Vienna summit emboldened Khrushchev to test Kennedy's resolve, leading directly to the construction of the Berlin Wall later that year. The quirky side note: interpreters at the summit reportedly struggled to keep up because both leaders spoke so quickly when irritated, resulting in moments where "you threaten us" became "we threaten you," a translation error that, thankfully, remained metaphorical. Scholars still argue whether Vienna exposed Kennedy's weakness or simply confirmed Khrushchev's impatience. Either way, the handshake left frostbite. Then comes the moment the planet almost didn't survive. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. 13 days that stretched longer than eternity. You find yourself in a White House basement, fluorescent lights flickering over exhausted men, ashtrays overflowing like miniature volcanoes. Kennedy leans over a map of the Caribbean, tracing circles around a small island that has suddenly become the center of existence. The mainstream fact: U.S. reconnaissance photographs revealed Soviet nuclear missiles stationed in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, sparking a standoff that brought the world within minutes of nuclear war. The quirky, morbidly comic detail: the film from the spy plane was processed in a Kodak facility in Rochester, New York, where technicians reportedly had no idea they were developing the fate of civilization. The scholarly debate that still fascinates historians was the crisis resolved through masterful diplomacy, sheer luck, or a combination of panic and caffeine. You suspect it was the last option. Diplomacy has never run purely on courage. In Moscow, Khrushchev paces his office like a restless bear in a too-small cage. His advisors argue, his phone rings, and somewhere outside, autumn rain taps against the Kremlin's windows like Morse code from heaven. He knows the U.S. blockade around Cuba is both a challenge and an invitation, a line drawn in salt water. The world watches as American ships inch toward Soviet freighters carrying more missiles. One wrong order, one itchy trigger finger, and bedtime history ends abruptly. You imagine the sound: silence, then light, then nothing. But instead, there's restraint, fragile, imperfect, miraculous. Back channels open, letters exchange hands, and in the middle of the tension, a young Soviet naval officer named Vasily Arkhipov refuses to approve a nuclear torpedo launch after believing war has already started. The mainstream fact: his refusal quite literally prevents World War III. The quirky epilogue. When asked later how he found the courage, Arkhipov simply said, "It didn't feel right." Scholars still debate whether his calm was instinct or miracle. You decide it doesn't matter, both deserve monuments. When the crisis ends, both leaders exhale in public while quietly aging 10 years in private. Khrushchev withdraws his missiles from Cuba, in exchange for Kennedy secretly removing American missiles from Turkey, though the U.S. never admits it until years later. The planet celebrates survival with a collective hangover. Kennedy's approval ratings soar, Khrushchev's less so. Yet the irony is that both men emerge humbler. The hotline is established, a direct phone line between Washington and Moscow to prevent future near-apocalypses. You can almost hear the click of the rotary dial as civilization installs its first panic button. The mainstream fact: the hotline went live in 1963, connecting the Pentagon to the Kremlin through secure teletype rather than voice, because no one trusted translation during adrenaline. The quirky human touch: early tests included sending poems and weather reports, as if to prove that even superpowers needed small talk. Scholars still argue whether the hotline symbolized genuine détente or just technological anxiety management. You like to think it was both. Communication, after all, is humanity's last defense against extinction. For a moment, the Cold War seems to relax, like a patient sedated but not cured. Kennedy delivers his famous American University speech in June 1963, urging both sides to re-examine our own attitude toward the Soviet Union. The tone is weary but hopeful. A man who has seen the abyss and prefers diplomacy to drama. The mainstream fact that speech leads directly to the limited nuclear test ban treaty later that year, the first significant arms control agreement of the Cold War. The quirky behind-the-scenes note: when the treaty was signed in Moscow, Soviet translators accidentally rendered mutual understanding as mutual indulgence, a slip that Khrushchev reportedly found hilarious. Scholars continue to debate whether Kennedy's push for arms control marked a genuine thaw or a temporary pause before the next freeze. History, like climate, has a habit of relapse. And then, Dallas, November 22, 1963. The world tilts. Kennedy's motorcade glides beneath a blue Texas sky, and in a few impossible seconds, the optimism of an era dissolves into static. The mainstream fact is simple and cruel. President Kennedy is assassinated, and the Cold War loses its most photogenic philosopher. The quirky anecdote: Soviet newspapers initially suspect an anti-communist conspiracy, while CIA memos briefly fear Soviet involvement, leading to several hours where both nations privately think the other has just declared war. Scholars still debate what might have happened had Kennedy lived. Would détente have come sooner? Would Vietnam have unfolded differently? You can't answer, and neither can history. Some stories, like grief, remain classified forever. Khrushchev, upon hearing the news, reportedly sits in silence for several minutes before whispering, "This is a tragedy for both our countries." It's an oddly intimate reaction for two rivals who never truly trusted each other. But that's the strange tenderness of the Cold War. Respect wrapped in rivalry. Empathy disguised as calculation. Within a year, Khrushchev himself is quietly removed from power, replaced by the more reserved Leonid Brezhnev. The shoe that once pounded the UN table is placed gently into storage, perhaps relieved. You linger now in that brief interlude of exhausted peace, the mid-1960s, when both nations, though still armed to the teeth, seemed to realize how close they came to erasing themselves. Nuclear arsenals continue to grow. Yes, but the rhetoric softens by half an octave. Musicians sing of peace, school children draw pictures of rockets shaped like doves, and somewhere, two former aides exchange Christmas cards out of habit. The Cold War hasn't ended, but it has blinked, acknowledging its own reflection. As the lights dim on this section of history, you imagine the ghostly outlines of two men: Kennedy, calm and analytical, staring through cigarette smoke; Khrushchev, stubborn and laughing too loudly, facing each other across the long table of time. One believes in charm, the other in blunt force, yet both discover that survival requires a little of each. The microphones are turned off now, the translations ended, the shoes and nerves both at rest. The world turns quietly, orbiting its fragile truce, while the stars above, utterly indifferent, continue their ancient business of shining. You wake to the soft hum of 1,000 machines listening in on silence. The year is somewhere between 1965 and 1985. The era when paranoia graduated from national mood to industrial complex. The bombs have quieted for now. The walls still stand, but the war has slipped inside the wires, threading itself through telephone lines, typewriters, and television antennas. You stretch and realize that every sound feels self-conscious, like history holding its breath to see who's recording. The world has entered what you might call the age of surveillance, though no one admits it out loud, because the microphones might be sensitive. The mainstream fact anchoring this invisible epoch is that in East Germany alone, the Ministry for State Security, better known as the Stasi, employed more than 90,000 full-time officers and nearly 200,000 informants, one for every 60 citizens. The quirky, somehow tender detail buried in that statistic. One Stasi file recorded a parrot, who habitually mimicked his owner's political jokes, prompting agents to classify the bird as a potential subversive influence. And the open scholarly debate that still flickers in conference halls is whether mass surveillance like this actually preserved social control, or instead rotted it from within. Whether a society can truly survive once its citizens learn to fear their own echoes. You listen, just for a moment, to the faint static of the 20th century, and you swear it sounds like breathing behind glass. You step into East Berlin again, this time after midnight, when the streets are so still that even the lamps seem to eavesdrop. Apartment blocks rise like gray filing cabinets, each window a potential witness. Inside, the wallpaper hums with microphones disguised as light switches. Neighbors trade smiles in daylight and reports at dusk. You feel the claustrophobia of courtesy. Everyone polite, everyone listening. Somewhere, a woman rewinds a cassette she shouldn't own. Somewhere else, a man carefully rehearses his laughter before the next house visit. The Stasi headquarters on Normanstrasse buzzes with a bureaucratic intensity that could power a small nation. Down the corridors, archivists label recordings with phrases like suspect tone, mildly ironic. You imagine the faint crackle of magnetic tape spooling through reel-to-reel machines, capturing the coughs, the sighs, the background ticking of humanity. The archivists don't listen for meaning, they listen for deviation. It's a symphony of paranoia scored for paper and fear. Across the border, the West hums its own electric paranoia. Washington, London, and Bonn install systems like Echelon, a global network designed to intercept communications for defense, which in practice means everything. The mainstream fact: by the 1970s, intelligence agencies of the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand formed the so-called Five Eyes Alliance, sharing intercepted signals across continents. The quirky historical echo. Early engineers allegedly tested satellite taps by eavesdropping on live broadcasts of the Beatles, leading one agent to file a report that began, "Subject, possible subversive message, all you need is love." Scholars still argue whether such monitoring created stability through vigilance or merely institutionalized distrust. You suspect the answer depends on which side of the wire one occupies. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens everywhere learn the art of self-censorship. In Prague, lovers whisper under park fountains to drown their words in water. In Buenos Aires, typewriter ribbons vanish after midnight because they might reveal what was written. Even in democratic nations, mail arrives pre-opened by mistake, the envelope scar sealed with bureaucratic neatness. You sense humanity entering its teenage years suspicious, self-conscious, and weirdly proud of its secrets. Technology becomes both confidant and informant. Telephones turn intimate conversations into public service announcements. You dial a friend and pause before the punchline, waiting for the static that means someone's chuckling on the other end. In the United States, the FBI's COINTELPRO program infiltrates civil rights movements and anti-war groups under the banner of national security. Agents file reports describing protest songs as agitational harmonies. The mainstream fact: from 1956 to 1971, COINTELPRO targeted organizations ranging from Martin Luther King Jr. Southern Christian Leadership Conference to the Black Panthers and even feminist collectives. The quirky trivia: one field office allegedly used a Ouija board to decide which activist meetings to raid, a story historians still can't confirm but which feels perfectly on brand for bureaucratic superstition. The academic quarrel that endures is whether democratic societies are inherently incapable of resisting the temptation to spy on dissent, whether freedom and fear are locked in permanent codependency. You can almost hear the Founding Fathers sighing in Morse code. Across the Iron Curtain, the Soviets perfect their own hardware of paranoia. In the KGB headquarters, Engineers designed microphones small enough to hide in matchboxes and transmitters embedded in chandeliers. One particularly infamous bug, the thing, was hidden inside a carved wooden seal of the United States given as a gift to the U.S. ambassador in Moscow in 1945. It hung on his office wall for 7 years, silently transmitting conversations directly to Soviet receivers. The quirky, almost adorable twist: it had no power source. It operated entirely on reflected radio waves, making it the world's first passive listening device. You can picture the Soviet engineers high-fiving in lab coats that smell faintly of solder and secrecy. Scholars still debate whether the Cold War's technological espionage accelerated innovation or merely transformed curiosity into a paranoid art form. And then came the wire itself. Not just metaphor, but infrastructure. Miles of copper veins buried under seas, connecting continents and conspiracies alike. The global phone network becomes the planet's nervous system, tingling with anxiety. The NSA learns to listen to ocean cables, while Soviet trawlers trail sonar lines disguised as fishing gear. You imagine Poseidon rolling his eyes as humanity installs microphones in his living room. Somewhere in the North Atlantic, an American submarine taps a Soviet undersea cable and records conversations for years. The operation is called Ivy Bells, and it's so secret even the dolphins probably had clearance. The mainstream fact: the project yielded intelligence so valuable that analysts called it the crown jewels of naval espionage. The quirky subplot: it was eventually exposed by a low-paid NSA employee who sold the information to the Soviets for cash, causing one agent to sigh, "Even betrayal has gone blue-collar." The scholarly debate still bubbling under the surface is whether secrecy of that scale serves security or simply postpones accountability until no one remembers why the wire was built in the first place. But for all the listening, the greatest secrets remain human. You walk through East Germany again in the 1970s, when every apartment radio has 2 dials, one for state stations and another for the forbidden voices from the West. Families gather after dark, curtains drawn, to hear the BBC or Radio Free Europe whisper forbidden news through the static. The sound feels illicit, like biting into chocolate during Lent. Children giggle, parents shush them, and the room fills with the scent of risk. The mainstream fact: the Stasi routinely triangulated illegal radio signals using vans disguised as milk trucks. The quirky footnote: one clever dissident allegedly trained his cat to jump onto the radio dial whenever the van stopped nearby, creating accidental interference. Scholars still debate whether underground broadcasting sustained morale or merely deepened citizens' dependence on rumor. You like to imagine it did both. Truth has always needed accomplices. Meanwhile, on the western side of the spectrum, corporations discover that data is delicious. Marketing firms begin collecting consumer habits with the same zeal intelligence agencies reserve for ideology. Grocery cards, credit records, telephone directories all become early fossils of a species that will one day call itself the information age. You notice how easily capitalism and surveillance become friends. After all, both are obsessed with knowing what people want. A wry mainstream detail. By the late 1970s, the U.S. Census Bureau stored so much information on magnetic tape that archivists joked the nation's soul could be erased by a magnet. The quirky prediction that surfaced in a 1968 computer science journal: one day machines may know us better than we know ourselves. Scholars today debate whether that line was satire or prophecy, but given your phone probably just buzzed, the answer seems academic. And still, amid all the tapping and decoding, ordinary life persists. Lovers write letters with invisible ink. Scientists publish genuine breakthroughs alongside classified footnotes. And children grow up playing with toy walkie-talkies, blissfully unaware they're rehearsing for adulthood. In kitchens from Moscow to Milwaukee, people lower their voices during dinner conversations and then laugh about it, because laughter is still the safest encryption. You picture a grandmother telling her grandson, "Walls have ears," and the boy replying, "Then let's whisper something worth hearing." Somewhere, an engineer designing the next great listening device accidentally records his own humming and keeps the tape, proof that even paranoia can produce melody. The mainstream historical crescendo of this era arrives in the early 1970s, when the Watergate scandal exposes that even the world's loudest democracy keeps its own secret microphones. The tapes roll, the president resigns, and suddenly everyone realizes that the act of listening has become universal and bipartisan. The quirky piece of trivia: when the White House recording system was dismantled, one technician reportedly saved a single screw for luck, which later sold at auction for the price of a decent surveillance drone. The scholarly argument that still echoes through political science lectures is whether transparency truly cures corruption or merely teaches it better camouflage. You suspect democracy, like audio, always carries a bit of background noise. By the 1980s, the machines have multiplied. Fiber optics replace copper, satellites bloom like steel flowers in orbit, and computers begin blinking in diplomatic offices with the same promise that early fire once gave cavemen. "Trust me, I'm useful." The East German surveillance state becomes so obsessed with cataloging that agents start collecting the smell of suspects in small cloth jars for use by tracking dogs. That's your quirky footnote. Geruchsproben, or scent samples, thousands of them stored in a climate-controlled archive like a perfume collection designed by Orwell. The mainstream fact: these were still being cataloged as late as 1988, and the scholarly debate continues. Was such devotion to omniscience proof of total control or total insecurity? The answer, perhaps, lies somewhere between sweat and absurdity. When the Berlin Wall finally cracks in 1989, the first rush through the checkpoints isn't for freedom but for files. Citizens storm Stasi buildings to rescue their own histories before they can be shredded. You walk through those corridors again, the air thick with dust and disbelief. People sift through boxes of recordings, reading transcripts of their own dinner conversations. Some find betrayal, others find jokes so banal they laugh until they cry. The sound of paper tearing becomes the city's strange music of liberation. The mainstream fact: over 100 kilometers of files were recovered, the largest archive of secret policing ever discovered. The quirky, heartbreaking note: volunteers later tried to reassemble shredded documents by hand, one paper at a time, a puzzle so massive that computer scientists still work on it today. A debate that haunts philosophers more than historians: can a society heal by reading its own wounds, or are some secrets best left unlistened to? You close your eyes and decide that truth, like radio static, may never go silent, only softer with distance. Outside, the modern world waits, humming with fiber optic arteries and glowing screens. The microphones are smaller now, the algorithms faster, but the melody familiar. Every email, every camera lens, every digital assistant is another descendant of those first hidden wires. You lean back and hear it, the eternal purr of connection disguised as comfort. History hasn't stopped listening. It's just switched formats. Somewhere in the night a satellite passes overhead, whispering data in binary lullabies. You breathe, knowing the story of walls, wires, and whispers never truly ends. It only changes frequency. And as you drift toward the next section, you smile at the quietest irony of all. After a century of eavesdropping, humanity has finally taught itself to speak in whispers loud enough for the whole world to hear. You wake to the smell of wet soil and jet fuel, the air thick enough to chew, somewhere between Saigon's neon hum and the endless green silence of a jungle that doesn't care who's winning. It's the 1960s again, but this time history trades its tuxedo for a uniform that never stays clean. The Cold War, tired of metaphors, has finally gone on vacation in Southeast Asia, and it's brought mosquitoes instead of diplomats. You can hear the soundtrack before you see the scene. helicopters thudding like anxious hearts, transistor radios coughing out rock and roll, distant thunder that might be weather or might be artillery. The mainstream fact at the core of this humid tragedy is that by 1968, over 500,000 U.S. troops were deployed in Vietnam, fighting not just the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, but the ghost of colonialism and the ego of two superpowers who couldn't stop measuring maps. The quirky, almost unbelievable side note: American engineers actually developed a tree eavesdropper. Tiny sensors disguised as foliage that transmitted enemy movement until locals began hanging laundry on them, accidentally jamming the signals with socks. And the open scholarly debate that still seeps through university lecture halls like morning mist is whether the Vietnam War was ever winnable or whether it was doomed from the moment ideology met humidity. You take another breath and feel the damp history cling to your lungs like memory refusing to evaporate. You move through the jungle as if through the mind of a world gone mad with contradictions. American soldiers hand out chocolate bars to children by day and burn villages by night, while North Vietnamese fighters slip through tunnels carved by grandparents who once hid from the French. Each side claims moral clarity, and both find mud instead. The war smells of sweat, gun oil, and government paperwork. Somewhere, an officer quotes democracy while radioing for napalm. You close your eyes and listen. The jungle hums, the insects roar, and beneath it all, the faint sound of tape recorders documenting everything for archives no one will ever read. The mainstream fact: Operation Rolling Thunder, the U.S. bombing campaign from 1965 to 1968, dropped more explosives on Vietnam than the Allies used in all of World War II. The quirky tidbit: one American general allegedly ordered his pilots to bomb the jungle until it glows, only to receive reports that it worked literally because of the chemical defoliants. Scholars still argue whether aerial warfare in Vietnam represented strategic necessity or moral collapse disguised as modernity. You watch the sky flicker orange, thinking how strange it is that light, the symbol of enlightenment, can also mean destruction when it falls too fast. Back home, television carries the war straight into living rooms. Dinner tables become front lines. Anchors read casualty numbers between weather updates. Commercials for toothpaste follow footage of villages on fire. The world's first televised war makes everyone an unwilling witness. You imagine a mother in Ohio turning down the volume as her son's face appears on screen for 3 seconds, labeled missing. The mainstream fact: Walter Cronkite's 1968 broadcast declaring the war unwinnable is often credited with shifting American public opinion against it. The quirky footnote: that same year, a toy maker released a line of Vietnam action figures that sold poorly because, as one child put it, they don't win. Scholars continue to debate whether media coverage shortened the war by exposing its futility or prolonged it by turning suffering into spectacle. You suspect the answer lies somewhere between compassion and curiosity, the two most unreliable witnesses in history. Across the Pacific, the Soviet Union and China cheer from a safe distance, shipping weapons and ideology but keeping their sons at home. Ho Chi Minh, frail but fierce, plays global chess with patience that borders on sainthood. In Moscow, Khrushchev's successors debate whether Vietnam is a moral crusade or an economic sinkhole. In Beijing, Mao sees it as proof that peasants can outlast empires. Meanwhile, American policymakers draft memos so contradictory they could be haiku. We must destroy the village to save it. You trace those words in the air and feel your pulse slow with disbelief. The war has become a mirror, reflecting not righteousness but reflex. In the jungles, time itself changes speed. Days blur into rain, nights into green-black eternity. Soldiers count survival in cigarettes, not victories. The mainstream fact: nearly 60,000 American troops and over 2 million Vietnamese civilians and fighters died before the war's end in 1975. The quirky fragment. Some U.S. soldiers swore they could hear the jungle whispering their names, later revealed to be frogs that mimicked human syllables, a phenomenon documented in a zoology journal no one had the heart to make funny. Scholars still debate whether the staggering losses accomplished anything measurable beyond proving that modern warfare could lose its humanity without losing its bureaucracy. You step carefully over a route that looks suspiciously like a scar. Back in Washington, the Pentagon Papers leak in 1971, confirming what everyone already suspects, that leaders have been lying about progress since before progress had a capital letter. You picture Daniel Ellsberg hunched over a Xerox machine at night, making copies of guilt. The mainstream fact: those documents revealed secret bombings in Cambodia and Laos, and internal admissions that no strategic objective is clear. The quirky detail: Ellsberg's friend Tony Russo once tried to smuggle a roll of film by taping it to the bottom of a salad bowl, perhaps the only moment in history when truth was literally tossed. The scholarly debate still humming like a ceiling fan is whether whistleblowing redeems democracy or simply exposes how fragile it already was. You can't decide. Both feel like confession after too long in the dark. You drift to Saigon in 1969, where the streets pulse with exhaust, propaganda, and French colonial architecture decaying with dignity. Bars overflow with journalists and mercenaries swapping stories for beer. In one corner, a guitar strums Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind, and nobody laughs at the irony anymore. American generals issue press briefings with charts that look like EKGs of denial. Somewhere in the Mekong Delta, a soldier writes his girlfriend a letter that begins, "I still don't know what we're doing here." By the time it arrives, the war has moved 2 provinces and 3 justifications away. The mainstream fact: President Nixon's policy of Vietnamization, training South Vietnamese forces to take over, was supposed to bring peace with honor. The quirky translation from an intercepted radio broadcast: North Vietnamese officers called it war with subtitles. Scholars still argue whether Nixon's plan was strategic withdrawal or political choreography. You think of it instead as the world's most expensive intermission. By 1972, America's anti-war movement has reached its crescendo. Students march, monks burn, musicians tour, and the Pentagon hires extra staff to read protest signs for intelligence value. The nation feels divided, not by borders but by decibels. Kent State becomes a wound that never fully heals. The mainstream fact: on May 4, 1970, National Guardsmen opened fire on unarmed protesters at Kent State University, killing 4 and wounding 9. The quirky, almost cinematic footnote: one bullet struck a student's copy of Catch-22, the novel about the absurdity of war. Irony delivered by trajectory. Scholars still debate whether such domestic unrest hastened the war's end or simply made cynicism fashionable. Either way, the 60s dream of moral clarity dies somewhere between a protest chant and a police siren. In Hanoi, peace talks drag on like a poorly dubbed soap opera. Delegates argue over the shape of the table before daring to discuss human lives. One insists on a round table, another on rectangular. Finally, someone proposes 2 half tables pushed together, a diplomatic compromise that could only make sense in a war this absurd. The mainstream fact: the Paris Peace Accords are signed in January 1973, formally ending U.S. involvement. The quirky follow-up: North Vietnamese delegates celebrated by going sightseeing at the Louvre, taking particular interest in paintings of revolutions that actually worked. Scholars continue to debate whether the accords were peace or merely an admission of exhaustion. You think they were both after all. Sometimes surrender is just honesty with better lighting. Then comes April 1975. Saigon collapsing like a mirage at sunrise. You stand on a rooftop watching helicopters evacuate embassy staff. while desperate civilians cling to the skids. The city hums with engines, chaos, and finality. The mainstream fact. The last American helicopter lifted off from the U.S. Embassy at dawn on April 30, 1975, marking the war's end and North Vietnam's victory. The quirky image history never forgets. A South Vietnamese pilot landing his small Cessna on the deck of the USS Midway with his wife and children aboard, clutching a map drawn on a napkin. Scholars still debate whether the fall of Saigon marked a communist triumph or an American tragedy. You decide it was neither. Just the sound of a story running out of adjectives. In the years that follow, Vietnam rebuilds itself slowly, stubbornly, beautifully. Farmers return to fields once glowing with Agent Orange. The soil forgives in patches. Children play in craters that fill with rain and call them lakes. Tourists eventually come, snapping photos of rusting tanks overgrown with vines. History, ever pragmatic, turns battlefields into backdrops. The mainstream fact, by the 1990s, Vietnam's economy begins opening to global trade, and former enemies exchange ambassadors instead of artillery. The quirky symbol of reconciliation. The first joint U.S.-Vietnamese project was to clear landmines from rice paddies, proving that even grudges can become agricultural partnerships. Scholars debate whether Vietnam's post-war recovery represents resilience or the world's guilty conscience finally paying interest. You suspect it's both. Redemption often smells faintly of fertilizer. You stand now in the same jungle decades later. The air quieter but never silent. Cicadas hum like old tape recorders. Leaves drip with the kind of peace that comes only after exhaustion. Somewhere nearby, an old veteran from each side meets the other. One wears a baseball cap, the other a straw hat, and they share cigarettes without translation. You watch them laugh about the rain, not the past. It strikes you that wars never really end. They just get quieter until they sound like weather. The Cold War will continue elsewhere. In deserts, in data, in orbit. But here, in this thick green stillness, you can almost believe the planet is trying to forget itself back into sanity. And as the jungle breathes around you, you understand what Vietnam truly proved. That ideology is loud, but nature always waits it out. The vines crawl back, the birds return, and the rivers carry away the ashes and acronyms alike. Somewhere, deep in the soil, a forgotten sensor still tries to transmit a signal to no one. It beeps faintly, echoing across years, across continents, the lonely sound of human ambition fading into the static of forgiveness. You wake to the sound of a saxophone drifting through static. Not quite jazz, not quite propaganda, a melody that feels like compromise with a drum beat. It's the 1970s now, and the world has discovered that maybe war is too expensive to keep fashionable. Superpowers, weary from decades of glaring contests and missile measuring, have decided to try something radical, pretending to get along. They call it détente, which sounds elegant in French because it means relaxation, and everything terrible sounds better in French. The air tastes different, less gunpowder, more polyester. The mainstream fact grounding this mellow illusion is that in 1972, U.S. President Richard Nixon became the first American leader to visit Moscow, meeting Leonid Brezhnev and signing the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I, to cap nuclear stockpiles. The quirky and almost comical footnote: Soviet officials, wanting to impress Nixon with Russian hospitality, reportedly gifted him a bear cub, leading to a short-lived but very real White House discussion about how to feed it on Air Force One. The open scholarly debate that still spins like a disco ball in political science circles is whether détente truly thawed relations or merely polished the ice. A pause, not a peace. You stand at the edge of that decade, listening to the hum of optimism piped through analog speakers and wonder if maybe history's best lullabies are the ones that almost sound sincere. The world begins to breathe again, or at least sigh. The newspapers speak of summits instead of crises, and for a brief moment, global politics feels like therapy sessions between exhausted roommates. In Washington, secretaries stockpile ashtrays for visiting Soviet delegations. In Moscow, translators rehearse small talk about baseball and peanut butter. You imagine Brezhnev practicing smiles in the mirror, his eyebrows twitching like Cold War barometers. The two men exchange limousines, vodka and flattery, both pretending détente is a marriage instead of a trial separation. Somewhere between them, the planet starts believing in the myth of moderation. Back home, Americans trade trench coats for leisure suits, and fear begins to shimmer under disco lights instead of air raid sirens. Television shows feature spies who solve crimes with charm, not cyanide. The Cold War is suddenly glamorous, espionage by day, glitter balls by night. You walk through a Manhattan club pulsing with synth beats, where the DJ fades from Donna Summer into David Bowie's Space Oddity, and for one dizzy moment you realize this generation dances to anxiety instead of running from it. The mainstream fact: the 1970s saw military budgets shrink slightly in both blocks for the first time since World War II. The quirky coincidence: at least 3 Soviet diplomats were documented taking disco lessons while posted in the West, under the pretext of cultural research. Scholars still argue whether détente represented genuine evolution or just the Cold War in bell-bottoms, the same rivalry but with better lighting. And yet, even as the music plays, you sense the walls listening. Behind every handshake is a backup plan, and behind every toast, a translator double-checking adjectives. In back rooms, the CIA and KGB continue their eternal chess game, though now they shake hands afterward and call it confidence building. A quiet race begins, not for missiles this time, but for influence in the developing world. Angola, Afghanistan, Chile, names whispered like test cases in an ideological lab. The mainstream fact: détente never truly ended proxy conflicts. In 1973 alone, the US and USSR backed opposing sides in 6 different wars. The quirky, tragicomic vignette: one African coup leader funded by both sides at different times once joked, "When superpowers argue, I buy 2 uniforms." Scholars still debate whether détente failed because of mistrust or succeeded precisely because mistrust was all it ever promised to manage. Meanwhile, at home, trust unravels faster than a polyester collar. Nixon, who sold détente as proof of his genius, becomes the first U.S. president to resign in disgrace after Watergate exposes microphones in the Oval Office, the ultimate irony of an age obsessed with listening. You stand outside the White House in 1974, watching reporters swarm like flies over fallen fruit. The mainstream fact: Nixon's resignation on August 9, 1974, made Gerald Ford the first unelected American president. The quirky little echo of absurdity: among the Watergate tapes was a segment later dubbed the 18.5-minute gap, allegedly erased by accident, prompting comedians to call it America's shortest confession. The scholarly debate that persists: did Watergate weaken America's moral authority abroad, or strengthen democracy by proving even power can be fired? You think it did both. Confession and collapse often arrive holding hands. Across the ocean, Brezhnev's Soviet Union glows with petroleum pride. Oil prices surge after the 1973 OPEC crisis, and suddenly socialism can afford chandeliers again. Soviet citizens line up for imported Pepsi, Western jeans, and the illusion that the good life has arrived, though the shelves say otherwise. You walk through a Moscow department store where mannequins wear American smiles under fluorescent lights that buzz like tired bees. The mainstream fact: the USSR's brief oil windfall in the 1970s temporarily masked deep economic stagnation, inflating growth statistics through raw exports. The quirky pop culture symbol, a 1974 Soviet musical called The Big Change, became a nationwide hit for its cheerful portrayal of night school students learning Marxism to a swing beat, proof that even propaganda had a dance phase. Scholars still debate whether Brezhnev's era was stable governance or just stagnation disguised as calm. You suspect it was both, a nap mistaken for peace. Somewhere between disco clubs and détente dinners, the world rediscovers color. Olympic Games become pageants of diplomacy. Cosmonauts and astronauts smile for cameras while trading flags and chewing gum in orbit. The Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975 feels like science fiction's version of therapy. For one weightless week, two superpowers pretend gravity has been abolished, and humanity floats above its own insecurities. The mainstream fact that mission marked the first physical docking of American and Soviet spacecraft. The quirky detail. One of the astronauts brought a miniature disco ball aboard as a joke, letting it spin under weightlessness while Bowie played in their headphones. The scholarly debate that survives today: did these gestures of cooperation truly soften enmity or simply provide photogenic proof that rivalry had good lighting? You shrug, peace, even temporary, photographs beautifully. In the Western world, détente seeps into fashion and humor. Spy thrillers become ironic. Television shows mock bureaucrats instead of glorifying generals. And comedians turn nuclear anxiety into punchlines that earn nervous applause. In bars, people joke that the Russians are coming, but this time they're bringing vodka. The mainstream fact: in 1975, vodka imports into the U.S. nearly tripled, making Smirnoff an accidental ambassador of détente. The quirky twist: some American bars began labeling cocktails as peace punch and strategic lime-tini. Scholars still debate whether cultural exchange can ever substitute for genuine reconciliation, or if it merely numbs the symptoms of distrust. You take a sip of the imaginary lime-tini and decide that numbness properly mixed might count as progress. Still, détente's warmth has limits. Beneath the glitter, shadows gather. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 extinguishes the last flicker of cooperation like a candle in a draft. Jimmy Carter, once the soft-spoken preacher of peace, now speaks of sanctions and boycotts. Moscow responds with stoic indifference, and suddenly everyone remembers their lines from the 1950s. The mainstream fact: Carter's decision to boycott the 1980 Moscow Olympics marked the symbolic end of détente. The quirky anecdote: one U.S. official suggested replacing the Games with a Goodwill Olympics in Hawaii, a proposal that drew exactly 0 participants but 2 enthusiastic travel agents. Scholars still debate whether détente was sabotaged by ideology, economics, or simply exhaustion. You lean back and listen to the faint crackle of vinyl somewhere in the distance, Bee Gees fading into Brezhnev, and realize history's mood lighting has turned blue again. Meanwhile, back in everyday life, people keep dancing. In Berlin, the wall glows faintly under neon graffiti. In New York, Studio 54 becomes a temple where politics dissolve into sequins. In Leningrad, secret clubs spin contraband disco records pressed on X-ray film, skeletons literally vibrating to Western beats. The mainstream fact: bone music remained a black market phenomenon in the Soviet bloc through the early 1980s. The quirky gem: one recording of the Bee Gees' "Stayin' Alive" was traced on an actual chest X-ray showing cracked ribs, turning defiance into dark poetry. The scholarly debate still echoing in cultural studies: did music's universality erode ideological barriers, or simply give both sides a prettier soundtrack for waiting out the inevitable? You figure it hardly matters. Rhythm has always been humanity's most successful peace treaty. As the decade winds down, détente fades not with a bang but with paperwork. Treaties gather dust, translators retire, and disco's mirror ball stops spinning. Reagan and Thatcher rise in the West, speaking in moral absolutes again. The Soviets dig in their heels with Brezhnev's successors, who look increasingly embalmed while alive. The warmth drains slowly from the decade's vocabulary, leaving behind a kind of sentimental frostbite. You picture an abandoned embassy banquet hall, tables still set for guests who never returned, champagne long since flat. The Cold War is ready for its sequel, but for one fleeting generation, the world did manage to dance between explosions. And as the music fades into that soft vinyl hiss, you realize détente wasn't really about peace, it was about catching our breath. It taught humanity how to sigh together without screaming. The glitter, the handshakes, the mirrored smiles, all just ways of learning that even enemies need intermissions. The stage lights dim now, and the world slips off its platform shoes. The dance is over, but the echo, the gentle thump of collective hope under the floorboards of history, keeps playing, soft enough to dream by. You wake to quiet, the kind that feels earned, like the pause after thunder. The Cold War is over, though its shadow still stretches thinly across the morning, soft but persistent, like condensation on a window that hasn't yet decided whether to fade. You sit up, the air a mixture of nostalgia and relief, and realize that the century's longest argument has finally gone to bed. For nearly half a century, humanity slept beside its own nightmares, missiles on standby, ideologies with insomnia, children dreaming in fallout shelters, and yet, somehow, the dawn still came. The mainstream fact anchoring this gentler hour is that since 1991, not a single nuclear weapon has been used in combat, a fragile record of restraint unmatched in human history. The quirky, almost tender detail: some of the missile silos in North Dakota and Kazakhstan have been converted into museums, where visitors can press the same buttons that once could have ended everything and instead hear a soft chime saying, "Simulation complete." And the open scholarly debate that hums quietly in universities and living rooms alike is whether the Cold War truly ended at all, or simply changed its uniform, replaced ideology with information, walls with firewalls, spies with algorithms. You smile faintly at the thought, because history, like an old friend, never really leaves. It just stops knocking so loudly. Outside, the world hums differently now. The maps are the same, mostly, but the colors have shifted. Old borders softened into trade routes, rival flags exchanged for logos. Children born after 1991 don't flinch at sirens. They scroll instead. You walk through a city that was once divided and see cafes where checkpoints used to be, art galleries where bunkers once crouched, satellites instead of spies overhead. The mainstream fact: by the early 2000s, over half the planet was connected by the Internet, the same communication web once imagined as a defense network. The quirky digital echo. One early chat room in 1995 called itself Mutually Assured Discussion, attracting both retired physicists and teenagers arguing about peace treaties with emojis. Scholars still debate whether technology has dissolved the old rivalries or simply digitized them. You look at your reflection in a dark computer screen and realize that the new battleground is attention. No uniforms, no missiles, just stories competing for bandwidth. In the former Eastern Bloc, the ghosts of the old world linger politely, as if waiting for someone to ask them how they've been. Monuments crumble into playgrounds. Once secret archives become tourist attractions. The mainstream fact: after 1991, more than 2 million classified KGB and Stasi documents were declassified, opening entire shelves of history to daylight. The quirky exhibit. One museum in Leipzig preserved an original Stasi listening device inside a teapot, labeled for serving both tea and truth. Scholars still debate whether transparency heals or simply rearranges pain, if knowing everything is the same as understanding it. You walk through those exhibits slowly, the air thick with dust and memory, and realize the past doesn't vanish, it becomes furniture. Across the Atlantic, The United States finds itself alone on a very large stage. No rival superpower to argue with, no ideological mirror to correct its posture. The mainstream fact: by 1995, U.S. military spending exceeded that of the next 10 nations combined, a budget built for a duel that never quite resumed. The quirky domestic paradox. One Pentagon study jokingly labeled this new era victory maintenance, as if peace itself required service inspections. Scholars still debate whether unipolar power brought stability or simply loneliness. You wander through Washington at dusk, marble glowing like old certainty, and think that even triumph left unshared begins to echo like guilt. Farther east, China begins to hum louder, mixing communism with capitalism like a chef ignoring recipes but somehow making it taste familiar. The mainstream fact: by the 2010s, China's economy surpassed the Soviet Union's entire lifetime output, transforming it into a global power that quotes Marx in PowerPoint. The quirky linguistic twist: Chinese internet users nicknamed their hybrid system socialism with Wi-Fi. Scholars still debate whether this represents the Cold War's ideological heir or its cleverest escape. You sip green tea in a Shanghai cafe, neon lights reflecting off the river, and feel the future already negotiating terms with nostalgia. Europe, meanwhile, continues its slow experiment in unity. A continent once divided by tanks, now divided by bureaucracy. The mainstream fact: the European Union, born from post-war treaties, expanded eastward through the 2000s, embracing former Warsaw Pact nations under the same blue flag. The quirky diplomatic side effect: translators once struggled to fit the word solidarity into 24 official languages, concluding the only universal translation was silence followed by applause. Scholars still debate whether integration erased old ghosts or simply taught them new manners. You stroll through a borderless crossing, passport gathering dust, and realize peace sometimes feels like paperwork that finally stopped multiplying. The old atomic arsenals remain, smaller but not gone, sleeping beneath soil and treaties. Engineers maintain them like aging pets, fed, monitored, too dangerous to abandon, too sentimental to destroy. The mainstream fact: as of today, roughly 12,000 nuclear warheads still exist, mostly in the hands of the nations that once nearly ended each other. The quirky modern irony: one disarmament lab used decommissioned plutonium cores to power deep space probes, sending pieces of the Cold War quietly into the stars. Scholars still debate whether deterrence has matured into wisdom or just inertia. You look up at the night sky, imagining a spacecraft carrying a tiny fragment of human paranoia past Jupiter, glowing gently. Fear turned into light. At home, the everyday relics of that age have become collectibles. Fallout shelter signs sell on auction sites, and children who once practiced duck and cover now post photos of their grandkids doing the same pose for irony. The mainstream fact: historians now label the Cold War not merely as a conflict but as a cultural era, spanning architecture, music, fashion, and mindset. The quirky trend: retro cafes in Berlin and Warsaw decorate with Soviet toasters and NASA posters, marketing nostalgia as aesthetic détente. Scholars still debate whether remembering keeps danger distant or invites it back through the gift shop. You sip your latte under a hammer and sickle light fixture and think that irony may be humanity's favorite peace treaty. In literature, the Cold War has become bedtime reading, spies as metaphors, paranoia as poetry. The mainstream fact: novels by authors like John le Carré and Alexandra Solzhenitsyn remain bestsellers decades after the missiles were silenced. The quirky classroom anecdote: one college professor assigns the spy who came in from the cold every year, explaining, "It's not about espionage, it's about how people defrost." Scholars still debate whether these stories keep history alive or trap it in amber. You turn the page slowly, hearing the faint rustle of secrets settling into fiction. Generations later, the children of those who once feared the bomb now fear the algorithm. Yet the emotional temperature feels oddly familiar, that quiet hum of vigilance, that soft paranoia rebranded as security. The mainstream fact. Since 2010, global cyber warfare incidents have surged, with former Cold War adversaries once again trading invisible blows. The quirky 21st century echo. Hackers sometimes embed peace symbols in their code as digital signatures, creating friendly sabotage. Scholars still debate whether this new arena represents continuation or cautionary sequel. You watch the cursor blink, that tiny pulsing light repeating the rhythm of every radar screen from 1962, and realize we've simply swapped missiles for modems. And yet, amid all the recycled fears, there's still tenderness, the quiet heroism of endurance. The same species that once designed bombs to erase itself also built space stations where former enemies float together, sharing tea and sunrise. The mainstream fact. Since 2000, the International Space Station has hosted over 270 astronauts from 21 countries, orbiting in literal cooperation above the ruins of ideology. The quirky souvenir. One crew brewed the first espresso in orbit, using recycled water, toasting to peace and caffeine. Scholars still debate whether collaboration in orbit signifies evolution or necessity. You decide it doesn't matter. Progress, like gravity, only works when shared. You keep walking through decades now, noticing how history itself seems calmer. Its volume turned down but not muted. The Cold War's museums glow faintly at night, their exhibits dusted but not forgotten. Tour guides speak softly. School groups whisper reverently at glass cases displaying passports stamped Invalid. The air smells of polished metal and perspective. You realize that what was once terror has become lesson, and that lesson, however bruised, is survival. As evening deepens, you stand before a world map illuminated by soft golden light. It's a patchwork of memories now. Berlin's reunified streets, Washington's aging monuments, Moscow's neon skyline, Havana's music still playing in the humid dark. The world didn't end. It just changed shape, trading confrontation for conversation, fear for fatigue, propaganda for playlists, and somehow, through all of it, ordinary people kept going. Lovers meeting under curfews, parents telling bedtime stories during blackouts, scientists writing equations that would one day guide satellites instead of missiles. The Cold War wasn't just politics. It was proof that life adapts even to absurdity. The air around you grows slower now, softer, every sound stretching out, vowels lengthening, consonants yawning. The hum of the planet feels gentler, like an engine cooling down. You think of all the lives spent in the service of a fear that never fully arrived, of the countless hands that built shelters no one entered, of the children who practiced hiding under desks and grew up to raise families under skylines instead. You inhale, and the scent is unfamiliar, clean, almost weightless, the aroma of a century that finally let go. Maybe peace doesn't announce itself with trumpets or treaties. Maybe it just slips quietly into the room. Once exhaustion decides it has done enough, you sit back, close your eyes, and let the world dim. The last satellites drift across the sky like watchful fireflies, and the earth, that old blue negotiator, spins beneath them with infinite patience. Somewhere, a record player hums an old jazz tune once used to jam Soviet broadcasts. Somewhere else, a former spy waters his garden in peace. Somewhere farther still, a school teacher explains to her students what Cold War meant, and they blink as if hearing a fairy tale. The wind sighs through the trees. Steady, familiar, forgiving. History, for once, sounds like a lullaby. The darkness feels kind. The century exhales, and the stars, neutral as ever, keep shining. Indifferent but generous, watching the small planet that almost destroyed itself but instead chose clumsily, beautifully, to keep dreaming. Sweet dreams.